Through structuring programs and strategic initiatives, the IDB supports the country to achieve its economic growth in a sustainable and inclusive, lasting way. Through our programs, we support farming families to adopt cultivation techniques that combine environmental conservation and agricultural productivity. We are the only multilateral bank with a unit dedicated to the Amazon region that seeks to encourage sustainable and inclusive economic development models, aiming to benefit its diverse communities. We also support protagonists of the Brazilian economy to mobilize resources in the growing bond or thematic bonds market in partnership with actors such as Bindes, Banco do Brasil, Eletrobras, and Banco ABC Brasil. And with our partners, we seek to innovate in sectors such as transport. We focus on the country's greatest asset, its people. In Salvador, we are helping to boost tourism as a source of work, income, and vocation for micro-entrepreneurs, especially Black women. We provide technical and financial support to health departments and also to the private sector to confront the pandemic and its effects, also in hospital finances. Aiming to empower young people for the technology job market, we help to take programming courses to women, Black, and trans people. For the country and its citizens to realize its potential, we also channel efforts and resources for the country to move forward in its physical and digital infrastructure. There are 26 million reais in investments made possible with support from the IDB for structuring public-private partnerships in the country. In the water and sanitation sector, with the social environmental program of the Igarapes of Manaus in Prosamim, we have been helping to overcome the challenge of stilts. Furthermore, we support the country's digital transformation because we believe in its potential to bring more efficiency and productivity. And how is the IDB Group structured to support Brazil? With more than 120 professionals with in-depth knowledge of the country allocated in our offices in Brasilia and Sao Paulo, the IDB Group is a long-standing partner of Brazil's development. We offer the country's support to the public sector through the IDB, to private sector companies through IDB Invest, and to the innovation ecosystem through IDB Lab. More than financing, we offer technical knowledge and build bridges between local, regional, and global solutions. Inter-American Development Bank.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, welcome to this G20 side meeting in Brazil, hosted by the Inter-American Development Bank Group, the IDB. Our focus today is on amplifying climate and green financing to achieve our climate and biodiversity objectives. The Brazilian presidency of the G20 has recognized the urgent need to bridge the global financing gap in these areas. We believe financial innovation is key to attracting private sector investment into impactful projects. Today, we'll explore how multilateral development banks, international organizations, governments, and the private sector can work together to turn these challenges into opportunities for a more sustainable future. The event today will have simultaneous translation from English and Portuguese. If you need it, please reach out to the desk at the entrance of the auditorium. For our speakers today, please feel comfortable to speak in the language of your preference. Now, I'd like to invite for the opening section our host and first guests. Mr. Ilan Goldfein, President of the IDB. Ms. Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF. Mr. A.J. Banga, President of the World Bank. And representing the Ministry of Finance of Brazil, the Executive Secretary, Mr. Dario Durigan. Welcome. Well, our host today, as I've mentioned, is Mr. Ilan Goldfein, President of the IDB since December 2022. He previously directed the IMF's Western Hemisphere Department in 2022 and led the Banco Central do Brasil from 2016 to 2019, being recognized as the Central Banker of the Year in 2017 and 2018. Mr. Goldfein has also held prominent roles in Brazil's private financial sector, including Chief Economist at Itaú Unibanco. Now I invite Mr. Ilan Goldfein for his opening remarks.
Boa tarde a todos. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for joining us for our conversation on financial innovation, climate, development. I have the pleasure here to have my colleagues, good friends, Cristalina, AJ, also the Ministry of Finance, the Vice Minister, Mr. Dario. We, of course, all feel that we miss Fernando Haddad, our minister, but we understand that he could not join us because of our diseases that are going on, COVID, so it's still there. Let me tell you that the challenges we face with climate change, the more I see, the more I'm convinced that we need to make a real difference. We need to transform for scale and impact of our actions as a development banks, as institutions, financial institutions. We need to both tackle climate change. If we do it just for scale, it's not going to be enough. But scale is very important to tackle climate change. The calculations for Latin America basically say that we need to invest up to 1.3 trillion reais, $1.3 trillion, which means 6.5 trillion reais per year, 12% of GDP. If we sum all that we have been providing the region, World Bank, IDB, others, it sums only 3% of that. 3%, that's all. So that means that we need to scale. We need to bring the private sector with us. We need to innovate. At the beginning, the call was for development banks to improve their balance sheet, to increase the scale. The famous capital adequacy frameworks. We are doing it. We've done it. We will continue to do it. Exchange exposure arrangement, credit substitution guarantees. We transfer credit, and more other things. Now we want to have also SDR-denominated hybrid debt issuance with the help of the IMF and other governments. Let's see if we can get it, because for every SDR allocated in our balance sheet, it means that we can lend up to 7 to 8 times more. So that's basically us doing our homework to be able to scale. And what does it mean to scale? Just to give you an example, the IDB. If we do things the way we're planning, we can get up to $112 billion, 560 billion reais in the next 10 years, more than we have now. And that means that we can triple our finance to climate from 50 million to 150 billion, from 50 billion to 150 billion dollars over the next 10 years. So that means that we can do much more. We are heading at the IDB next week to our very important annual meeting. For the first time ever, we're going to have 3 transformational changes at the same time. It never happened at the ADB that we had an annual meeting as important. It's an annual meeting that will define our new institutional strategy until 2030. It's an annual meeting that will define the capitalization of the IDB Invest, our private sector hand, and it will be also the annual meetings that replenish the resources of the IDB Lab. The last 2 are very important for private sector. The institutional strategy will be enabler of bringing more resources. But here today, we are here to talk about financial innovation. So let me tell you about a little bit what we have done at the IDB before. First, we try to help countries issue more debt that is linked to sustainable goals. Uruguay, they issue a debt sustainability link to indicators. Huge success. At the IDB, we tried to emulate the same incentives, and we created the BID Clima, which means that our loans will have lower borrowing costs if the country reaches targets like deforestation, CO2 emissions, verifiable indicators. We have 9 pilots, and they're already starting to work. You reach your target, you get lower borrowing costs. We use the concessionality money at the right time, at the right moment. But that's not all. We left the pandemic with countries with very high debt. But it's also a period of high interest rates and high risk. So let's take this challenge as an opportunity and do debt swaps, which basically brings debt to ambitious goals together. And we have done it at the IDB with the largest debt swap with Ecuador that basically gave them $1 billion of saving. Half of it is going to Galapagos. The other half reduces borrowing costs. Huge success. So many countries are coming. Debt for nature, debt for climate, debt for health, debt for education. But this is not going to be here forever because interest rates will not stay as high forever. Hopefully risk will go down. So this is the timing to try to get a very important challenge debt into an opportunity, into directing the resources of the saving to what we would like to do. That's number 2. Let me now talk about what we have just signed with the Brazilian Finance Ministry, with the Brazilian Environmental Ministry, with Marina Silva, and with other partners, including the World Bank and the UK government, which is basically trying to solve an old problem that now it's more emergency. We are close to the turning point. We need to act fast. So just saying this is a problem we cannot solve, who's going to get the risk, who's going to stay there, is not enough. Let's try it. So we have partner basically offering the conditions that the IDB have when it negotiates swaps or negotiates options, transfer them to Brazil so that the cost of protection goes down. Doesn't mean there's no cost. There's no magic. We're just transferring something to lower cost. That's all. In addition, we're going to provide line of credit, which when a company needs liquidity, when it gets a high depreciation, a very large depreciation, then we can provide a 10-year loan in the case the depreciation is very high. And there's a lot of lines. This is just part of it. I was promising the Rio that we need to communicate simple in tranches, so I'm not going to get to the rest of it. But this is an old problem with a new initiative. But the only thing I can tell you is that if we are managed to do it, we will be able to replicate it for other countries and other places. So just to conclude, we are now collaborating with the Brazilian government. We collaborate with the IMF in several instances. We signed an historic MOU with the World Bank. And I just want to tell you that there's tremendous interest in these financial innovations tools. There's also a lot of gains from the collaboration. We believe that together we can mobilize more private investment and do much more to tackle climate change and other challenges, both here in Brazil and elsewhere. I hope you'll work with us to do more of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goldfein, for your reflections. Our next speaker will be Ms. Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF since 2019. Prior to the IMF, she was the CEO of the World Bank and served as European Commission Vice President. She has also served on many international panels, including as co-chair of the United Nations Secretary General's high-level panel on humanitarian financing. Now I invite Ms. Kristalina Georgieva for her opening remarks. Please welcome.
Thank you very much. It is wonderful to be in Sao Paulo, wonderful to be in Brazil. I can say, with my limited knowledge of the language, obrigado. I want to start by saying that the topic we discussed today is really difficult. The climate crisis is already upon us, and we have to admit we have been a bit slow to address it. Even today, with all the mobilization around the world, if we put all the national determined contributions together, we would cut in this decade emissions only by 11%. And we have to go somewhere between 25 and 50% to succeed. So to mobilize financing for mitigation, adaptation, and transition is a paramount priority also for our economies, because if we don't, climate shocks would affect the performance of our economies, the well-being of people and businesses, and we will be missing on the fantastic opportunity of the green transition. When we look at the numbers, they are gigantic. Just for emerging markets, just for the mitigation side of the climate fight, we would need 2 trillion a year, and some experts actually say, no, 3 trillion a year, starting in the next years and going year after year after year. We don't quite yet have this money. And the question is, how do we get it? How do we get there? From the perspective of the IMF, I want to make 4 points. First, we are still wasting money on activities that are actually creating the climate problem. Last year, direct fossil fuel subsidies reached $1.3 trillion. If we take into account the indirect subsidies, the fact that we don't put a full price on carbon, that there are health impacts of fossil fuel-related pollution, if we aggregate all this, we are talking about $7 trillion. Obviously, we have to find policy ways to redirect money, being mindful how we do it, because if we do it poorly and we affect especially poor people, then what we would have is protests on the street. So this area of how we can deal with subsidies and create incentives for decarbonization is one that we at the fund take to heart. 2, we recognize that to get more public investment, it would depend on the ability of the public purse to efficiently and effectively collect taxes and deploy the money well. At the IMF, we have started together with the World Bank a big program on domestic resource mobilization that aims to address this, to improve the quality of revenues and quality of spending, but also to focus on three, on local capital markets development and the ability with local currency to take on a long-term investment in a predictable manner. And four, we all have to pitch in. For us at the IMF, that meant two things. One, creating a designated instrument to finance the climate, support countries to finance the climate transition. It is called Resilience and Sustainability Trust. We created it in a very interesting way. Do you know, Ilan mentioned it, special drawing rights. This is what we at the fund create on the strength of our members, and in 2021 we allocated 650 billion of those special drawing rights to countries that needed reserves and liquidity, and to countries that didn't need it because they had strong reserve position to begin with. So we went to these countries and said, why don't you lend us some of those dormant SDRs, and we can create a positive 40 billion strong fund to support our members struggling with the green transition. And of course, we want to see this 40 billion mobilizing private finance, multiplying, as Ilan said, he wants to do with the SDRs over there. To conclude, it is tough, but it is not impossible. How many of the audience are Brazilians? Raise your hand. So, Pelé, what did Pelé say on this topic? Pelé said, the tougher the victory, the more you enjoy it. So we are gonna win this mobilization, and we will enjoy it for the benefit of our kids and their children. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Georgieva, for your insights. Our next guest for this opening section is Mr. Dario Durigan, Executive Secretary of the Ministry of Finance. Mr. Durigan holds a law degree from the University of São Paulo and a master's degree in law and legal research from the University of Brasilia. He served as a legal affairs advisor to the Civil House of the Presidency of the Republic. He has also served in the Attorney General's office. In the private sector, Mr. Durigan was Director of Public Policies for WhatsApp in Brazil. Mr. Durigan, I welcome you for your opening remarks, please.
Hi, everyone. Oi, todo mundo. Meu nome é Dario Durigan, sou secretário executivo do Ministério da Fazenda e hoje estou tendo a honra de manhã, na primeira sessão do G20, tive a honra e agora à tarde também de representar o ministro Fernando Haddad em todo esse evento tão importante. I will switch to English. It was just a very quick greeting here in Portuguese. So it's an honor for me to speak on behalf of Minister Fernando Haddad, which is in this very important event sessions in the G20 presidency of Brazil. The topics that we will discuss today could not be more relevant. President Lula and also Minister Haddad have been pushing an ambitious agenda of economic reforms in the country. They include new fiscal rules. We've been talking before here in the backstage about the importance of the new fiscal landmark approved last year by the Congress that assured macroeconomic stability that we are seeing now. Also a broad tax reform, historic tax reform we approved last year in Congress, the first democratic tax reform approved in Brazil. along with other regulations, smart regulation, state-of-the-art adjustments in the legislation of Brazil. We're fighting the litigation culture of the country and so on. All those measures were drafted by our team, and we have been doing a great effort to gather the best experts from the public administration in Brazil, people who knows economy, who knows politics, who knows public administration, and I think we have achieved that. We have a great team at the ministry. And at the same time, we know that it's very important to have this team talking to the international experts. And this is, I think, the most centered topic of this meeting from my side. All these measures were drafted by our team, taking into consideration the best international practices provided by the staff of international institutions, such as IMF, World Bank, and IDB. Creating new financial instruments and overcoming existing barriers to foreign investments are fundamental to expanding green investments in Brazil and Latin America. At the Ministry of Finance, under the leadership of Minister Fernando Haddad, we have sought to position Brazil at the center of this debate. Earlier this week, we launched the Eco Investment Brazil with a press conference along with the IDB and the World Bank. It will be indispensable complement to our ecological transformation plan, which aims not only to decarbonize our economy, but also to enhance the technological and industrial capabilities of our productive sector. We will continue to seek to launch new financial solutions developed by our best technicians, always with the support of international institutions. So it's a great honor for me to be here alongside with Mr. Ilan, President of the IDB and a key supporter of a bunch of measures that we are launching at the Ministry of Finance. And I will highlight here the Eco Investment Brazil, this very important program that we launched this week. And I also want to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Banga, President of the World Bank, a great partner of us. We have been discussing with the World Bank forest investments, and since the beginning, they have been a great partner for us in the ecological transformation plan. Finally, I would also like to thank Ms. Georgieva Kristalina for her generous words about tax reform earlier this week, and the dialogue with the IMF was crucial in shaping our key measures last year, especially the fiscal framework. This opening session represents the alignment of the Ministry of Finance with the international institutions in the joint effort to establish the foundations of a new economic policy. Mr. Haddad has been pointing out this, and I think this is a great mark of our administration in Brazil since last year. Thank you very much, and thank you, the representatives of the institutions here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Durigan. We had to make this switch in the order of the speakers because Mr. Durigan is going to open the ministerial session at the G20 Brazil, a very busy schedule today, right? So whenever you have to leave, please, Mr. Durigan, feel free. Thank you once again. Now let's continue. Let me introduce you to Mr. A.J. Banga, President of the World Bank. Mr. Banga served as Vice-Chairman at General Atlantic, was President and CEO of MasterCard, and Honorary Chairman of the International Chamber of Commerce. He's also a co-founder of the Cyber Readiness Institute. Mr. Banga, I invite you now for your opening remarks, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm going to talk about three things. And the first thing is that at COP28, the World Bank made two commitments that are relevant to this discussion. And the first one is that by 2030, 45% of our financing would go towards climate-related financing, half towards mitigation, half towards adaptation. Why the half and the half? Because it's not that we will be unhappy if it becomes 52% versus 48. It's not the 50%. It's to show people that climate is not only about mitigation. It is equally important to do something about adaptation. And doing the right thing on adaptation is actually the right thing for development, because what constitutes climate adaptation investment? It is schools that can weather a climate catastrophe. It is roads that can handle a climate catastrophe. It is heat-resistant varieties of seeds and drip irrigation and digital education in the event of a catastrophe so that kids don't miss out on education. Those are all adaptation. They are nothing other than development expenses. But we don't seem to understand the importance of being equally conscious about mitigation and adaptation. So the idea was to focus the World Bank attention on both things being important. The second thing we talked about was voluntary carbon markets. And this comes a little bit to Kristalina's point about where will the resources come from. She spoke about subsidies and direct resource mobilization. Another one is a voluntary carbon market. Unfortunately, and Ilan mentioned them too, over the years they have not done as well as people had hoped they would do to help channel money from the developed world to the developing world, if the developing world were to do the right things in terms of aspects of green and climate that they deserve to be paid for as global public goods. Why is that? Because of the fear of greenwashing, and in some cases the feeling that people were taking the easy way out on these credits. What we are trying to do is forestry projects, which is what the minister was referring to, forestry projects where the World Bank is involved directly, where we can do some degree of jurisdictional audit, that trees are not being cut here to be planted there, and where we can do a social audit to ensure that most of the money that comes from the sale of that carbon credit goes to the community and not just to the government, so that the incentive to cut the tree down when you turn your back is not there. That idea of both environmental integrity and social integrity of these carbon credits is what we are going to do with 15 countries in forestry, and attempt to get it going over the coming period and see if with this stamp of integrity, of environment and social integrity, can we get a price for the carbon credit that goes beyond the $6 or $7 that ton that today we are getting in the market to something closer to 15, 20, let alone the 40 and 50 that people would like to get to. That's the second thing. The third thing has to do with the private sector. So Kristalina and Ilan both mentioned that you cannot do this without the private sector. So let's pick renewable energy. The private sector knows that wind and solar today, per unit of delivered cost, are cheaper over time than fossil fuel-based electricity. They know that. There may be a longer gestation period, there may be a higher capital cost in the beginning, but eventually the line goes in the correct direction. So then why is it that trillions are not rushing in to be invested in solar and wind in the countries, particularly the middle-income countries, where the consumption of electricity will grow as their population and prosperity grows, and that will change the impact of all the savings you might have in the developed world on the mix of electricity and its emissions. So how do you change this? Why is it that people are not running in to invest in these countries? And basically, the private sector lab we set up, and I don't know if Mark Carney is still here, but he was speaking with us a little while ago, but he helped us set this up. And essentially what we learned from 15 CEOs is 4 things that talk about the financing required to merely make the trillions come true that both Ilan and Kristalina referred to. And the first one is regulatory policy clarity. If a country is clear that they are going in a certain direction on a percentage of their revenue, of their energy mix that will come from renewables, and if they create the right policies, at least some of them clarifying tariffs, utility, liquidity and the like, you will find that the private sector gets highly reassured by the fact that there is an area here that they can understand and invest in. I give the example of India often on this. India declared in Prime Minister Modi's first term that he would aim for 30% by solar by 2030. He's currently in manufacturing capacity at 42%. There's still a few years to go. He has to connect the grids. He has to organize the right technology. He's doing some of that. but hopefully we'll get to 30 by 2030. And a large part of it came from the regulatory clarity that his government provided early in their first term. The second thing that comes up is, even if you get that, it's political risk insurance. And that's where the World Bank can play a bigger role. We have an institution called MIGA, which provides political risk insurance and does about $6 to $7 billion a year for the private sector in such circumstances. We want to get to 20 by the year 2030. And in fact, we've got approval from our board to provide that same platform for IDB and other multilateral development banks as well, so that he doesn't have to reinvent that platform, but he can release his capital through these guarantees that can be written on our books. What we're doing is to combine the different places in the World Bank where these guarantees were being originated. There were almost 20 different locations in the bank, 20 different types of guarantees. We're bringing them together into 3 simple categories, putting them together under MIGA, creating a simple cafeteria-style menu of how a country can understand and a private company can understand what kind of guarantee they need, political risk, credit guarantee, or a commercial guarantee. And that's what we're going to do. We're increasing the staff in our guarantee business outside of Washington, D.C. by 40%, so that countries and clients in these countries can reach this guarantee easier. That's the second big issue that the private sector was speaking to. The third one, Ilan mentioned, foreign exchange. This is the hardest one. And while Ilan is making a big effort in Brazil with the government to start a hedging platform, he and I both know this is not easy. It requires scale, it requires risk capital, and it requires creative ways of thinking about this. Our private sector lab has a couple of suggestions for us that we are working on, including risk-sharing models, where you can take the risk between the private investor, the government, and then the multilateral banks taking the tail risk of an investment of this type. Last item, despite this all, would be the idea of originating to distribute, meaning can we create a marketplace where these assets and such things can be securitized so that pension funds and investors can find a way to understand these loans and securitize them. The problem is, if you look at our balance sheets today, all these loans are very bespoke. You cannot create a securitization market where every loan is bespoke. You need a degree of standardization and a way of originating these loans to create such a market. This is probably the longest term solution and something that we're still working on. So, 3 different topics. Very important to understand that we've got these commitments, why mitigation and adaptation, 2, the voluntary carbon markets for forestry that we want to try and seed, and finally, the work with the private sector, where I believe over the next year or 2, we should begin to see real results coming out of all this effort. So Ilan, thank you for hosting us, and thank you for being my friend and partner, and thank you, Kristalina.
Thank you, Mr. Banga, for your thoughts. Thank you all for the presence. I know you also have a very busy schedule today. So a round of applause for our guests, please. So let's move on. Now we'll have our first section on financial innovation for climate investments. Humanity is facing a challenge. Climate change, once thought as a problem for the next generation, is manifesting its presence by the day. How can we address this? We need to shift climate financing from billions to trillions. Mobilization of private capital is crucial, and it will require building a conducive and enabling environment and creative financial solutions to mitigate risks and barriers for investment on a much larger scale. How can we face this life-changing challenge? Our keynote speaker today will be Mr. Mark Carney, the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and co-chair for the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, a practitioner-led coalition working to accelerate the transition to a net zero economy. He previously served as governor of the Bank of England, governor of the Bank of Canada, and chair of the Financial Stability Board. He is a long-time and well-known advocate for sustainability, specifically with regard to the management and reduction of climate risks. Let's welcome to the stage Mr. Mark Carney.
Obrigado. Thank you very much. Thank you all for staying. And let me thank as well Dario and by extension Minister Haddad for the generous hospitality here, the excellent organization of these meetings. Those individuals are all going into a very high impact meeting, I can assure you from what I've seen. And also, more fundamentally, for Brazil's ambitious agendas to accelerate its own net zero transition and to put nature at the center of not just Brazil's efforts, but the world's efforts. And this impact is already being felt, first and foremost in the step change in protection of the Amazon, but also because the drive is reinforcing the momentum. And one of my messages, there's real momentum on financial innovation coming out of COP28 in Dubai a few months ago. And the commitments at COP28, if implemented, always the key thing in climate, if implemented, will close almost a third of the gap that the world needs to do between now and 2030. That is an enormous number, and it gives a sense of what happens when you focus on the big things. So I'm going to try to walk through some of the aspects of financial innovation that potentially has those impacts. And you heard some of that from the leaders of our multilateral institutions. Big picture, we're getting to a point, there's lots of negative news, and two things can be true at the same time. We're in more and more trouble because we have less and less margin of error. But the emissions curve is beginning to bend. It is beginning to bend. But at the same time, much more will need to happen to reach climate justice, both here in Brazil and around the world. And that requires financial innovation. And one of my points is that this financial innovation, we need to think about it as a system. We need to think about it together. The whole has to be greater than the sum of the parts. Just one FX facility is incredibly important, but it needs to be linked in with blended finance and other markets. So the way I want to organize my comments is around three gaps that we need to close. Data, action plans, and investment. Investment's obviously the most important, but the first two are necessary conditions in order to achieve the third. Quickly on climate data, because this issue around disclosure has been around for a long time. It was a little more than 8 years ago, Mike Bloomberg and I launched something called the TCFD at Paris. It was a voluntary approach to climate disclosure. By Glasgow 2 years or so ago, that voluntary approach had been taken about as far as it could go. So leading companies, including financial institutions here in Brazil, were working with TCFD, but it's really time for the authorities to pick up the baton and develop a standard of a quality of authority standards through something that was launched at Glasgow called the International Sustainability Standards Board. Now, if you know anything about the development of international standards, and this is a sophisticated audience, they developed those standards overnight. They were completed by June of last year, so within 18 months, in part because of the work that had come before, but it's still a remarkable achievement. And leading countries, led by Brazil, have now committed to make them mandatory by the middle of this decade. And I'd suggest that in that meeting, just across the way, the question for everybody who hasn't made that commitment is, why haven't you? You're a G20 country, you have this standard that's been proven to work, the leading jurisdictions are doing it. Make your commitment to mandatory implementation of disclosure, because we have to close that data gap. Next quick point on the data gap is disclosure is important. Those at the sharp end, if you will, of finance can use that to allocate capital, but every stakeholder should have freely available access to the key data. So disclosure by companies, what their targets are, how they're performing against targets. And those you saw on the stage, amongst others, the leaders of the OECD plus the FSB and others have come together to create something called the Net Zero Data Public Utility, which does basically that. All you need to know is that within a few years, we should have freely available access to see who's part of the solution, who's part of the problem. Okay, let me move to the second gap, which is around action plans, because disclosure just defines the problem. Action plans are needed to fix it. What we've done at GFANZ is to encourage our members to have net zero transition plans. Already over 250 of them are in train for this year. And policymakers in some of the major jurisdictions, the EU, the US, Singapore, Japan, Hong Kong, are already recommending this as a broader approach. A simple point. It took us 10 years to go from the concept of climate disclosure to mandatory. We can't wait another decade for plans to deal with the problem. So a simple message at the G20 is to get this into the heart of their recommendations for companies and financial institutions. And very importantly, as part and parcel of this, is to ensure that those transition plans and what's defined as transition finance is, of course, it is green finance. It's wind and solar, hydro, power, battery storage, but it also has to be going where the emissions are, going to those heavy emitting sectors and providing finance to get those emissions down. So not everybody in those heavy emitting sectors has plans or capability to do that, but you have to take on emissions in order to do that, or we will not get to net zero consistent with 1.5 degrees. Now, the only way we're going to get to where we need to go with those two building blocks, disclosure and action plans, is through investment. And so I want to spend the balance of my remarks just going through elements of that investment and how finance and some necessary financial innovation fits into it. The first and the bedrock of this is a continued acceleration in clean energy investment. And if you're looking for aspects of glass half full, part of the story is with respect to clean energy investment. Global clean energy investment has grown 40% since 2020 to 1.8 trillion. That is almost twice as much as the annual investment rate in conventional oil and gas. So it went from half as much to almost twice as much. That's the good news. The challenge is that growth curve needs to continue at the same rate. It's the fastest rate of growth in energy in history. It needs to continue at that rate. Now, a key outcome of COP28, one of the commitments that needs to be fulfilled, is that countries agreed to transition away from fossil fuels, carefully crafted language, but more tangibly to triple renewable capacity, clean energy capacity globally by 2030. Now that's basically tomorrow if you know about investment in this area. So action needs to be happening right now, and that tripling of energy capacity comes alongside with the commitment to double energy efficiency. But as I said a moment ago, it won't be enough to just do clean energy. We also need to go where the emissions are, which is in the heavy emitting sectors. So steel, aluminium, chemicals, cement, heavy duty transport, including marine and airlines. And this is hard. These are tough sectors to electrify. We need to build whole new facilities, manufacturing facilities. They're new fuels that are not economic yet and are potentially economic at large scale. There are often regulatory barriers that skew incentives, and it's very much a case of things being interconnected across energy sources and downstream. So if there's slow progress, let's say in hydrogen, it's going to slow progress in steel. And if steel doesn't demand hydrogen, it has the same impact. So there's a massive coordination issue. The consequence of that is that if you're in these sectors, your investors want their money back today. So they're in transition traps. They can't invest their cash flows in the necessary technologies, and we need to help break that. And part of what came out of COP28 is something called the Industrial Transition Accelerator. What you need to know about that is, first, that its goal is to get all of the leaders around the table in these sectors, in the energy sector that are providing solutions, the main standard setters in the various industries, so think the International Maritime Organization for shipping, for example, the key governments, of which Brazil obviously should be one, and crucially finance there at scale in real time so that this coordination problem is solved. And the way we're approaching this is to be brutally practical about it. With 1,300 companies, they alone are responsible for 17% of global emissions themselves. They're part of organizations that are part of this. We're setting a goal of COP30, so when we're here in less than 2 years' time, for investment decisions for large-scale decarbonization to focus the mind and unlock this. And crucially, I spoke about action plans a moment ago. What we're looking for is to build on plans such as we see in Brazil with Novo Industria, the ecological transformation plan, where countries have set out their priorities and their focus, and now the action is to go in with partners, not just private sector, but with partners at the IDB, the World Bank, et cetera, and put together financing packages to turn plans into reality. And that leads me to, and I still have 4 minutes, so good, leads me to my next point, which won't surprise you, that really to truly have a transition, it must be global. And in order to have a global transition, we need, and Avinash Persaud is here in the front row, he's helped lead this, we need a radical change in the international financial architecture. To the credit of the Brazilian presidency, that is front and center, because the reality is that we have collectively been caught what I would call a sort of paradox of prudence. So you have individual institutions that are being microprudentially careful. They're not lending to riskier new projects such as I just discussed in these heavy emitting sectors, but collectively it means capital is not getting there to solve the problem, and it's leading to this, it's contributing to this climate catastrophe. And in the end, nobody's AAA if there's no planet. That's the bottom line. And so to break that, again, it's a coordination game that's starting to be broken. Now, some of the solutions you've just heard. So the IDB's, full credit to the IDB on this innovative, and the Brazilian government and authorities on the FX facility. Super important. Let's hope that it can be replicated and scaled elsewhere. And as I say, combined with other instruments. The Resilience and Sustainability Trust of the IMF. And what Ajay just spoke to, he outlined an entire agenda, but he's delivering on that agenda today with a unified guarantee package out of the World Bank. The #1 ask of private sector providers of capital to accelerate transition in the emerging and developing world, and it's a real prospect to scale significantly capital. We've also seen, we saw at COP28, through the hosts, the Emiratis set up a new vehicle called Altera, $30 billion, a lot of money, their money, on the table for the transition, but designed in a way that should, and I think very much will, catalyze $250 billion for the transition. Included in that is a very innovative structure where there's a capping of the return to Altera for the transition in emerging and developing economies. And that allows much more capital to crowd in. So it's a challenge. It's a good in and of itself, but I also think of it as a challenge to others to do more. So I welcome Brazil's focus on this. And I'm going to finish by talking about nature. And like others, I'm going to start on carbon credits, which, of course, is a part of the broader story. It is, I would say it's beyond time, but it's time for the G20 to grasp the nettle on setting the standards for end-to-end integrity in voluntary carbon markets. This discussion has been going on for well over a decade. The world's been burning while it's been happening. And this is really an opportunity for hundreds of billions of dollars annually of capital to go from the developed economies through basically companies and financial institutions to projects in the emerging and developing world, ancillary benefits for biodiversity and direct benefits, if done right, for indigenous peoples. For that, we need supply integrity. A lot of work's been done. I'm going to give you an acronym, ICVCM. Demand integrity, in other words, who can buy these credits? You have to be working hard to get your emissions down to buy these credits, but VCMI and others have worked on that. Market integrity, bunch of plumbing stuff, important to people like me and former central bankers. Just rest assured, someone better make sure that's there. And crucially, social integrity, and Ajay spoke to this, and it's really a role that only the international the multilateral development banks and others can play. The private sector cannot play, cannot vouch for social integrity. And this leaves me with the final point about really the next frontier of financial innovation is around this intersection between nature and climate. Climate has become the dominant destroyer of nature. 70% of wildlife population's gone in my lifetime, 40% of our natural capital since the early 1990s. And conversely, nature-based solutions can be the cheapest form of emissions reductions if we get this right. And so through the Ecological Transformation Plan and its G20 leadership, Brazil can help bring nature to the heart of these solutions. So I'll conclude, like Kristalina, I will appeal to the rich literary heritage here, and the writer and indigenous leader, Alton Krenak, who defines, amongst other things, defines spirituality as the interdependence between all living things. And it's a reminder for us that everything is connected. As I've tried to stress in climate finance, it's all connected. We need to build these instruments and then bring them together. We can't manage what we don't measure, so we need disclosure. There's no point having disclosure unless we have plans to act on it. Those plans have to allow, and the financial system has to get capital to heavy emitting industries in the emerging economies. And finally, we need innovation in finance that recognizes that we're part of nature, not separate or a part of it. That natural value, or that the nature of value must recognize the value of nature for indigenous peoples, for local communities, and for all who live on this planet today and tomorrow. So thank you very much. Onwards.
Thanks, Mr. Mark Carney, for your insightful remarks. Now, I invite to the stage our moderator, Mr. Avinash Persaud, Special Advisor on Climate Change at the IDB, and our distinguished panelists, Mr. Rogério Seron, the Treasury Secretary of Brazil, and Sir Alok Sharma, Member of Parliament of the United Kingdom and former President of COP26. A round of applause for them, please. Thank you for the presence. Avinash, the floor is yours, please.
Obrigado, Ajana. Let me just give a context to this panel for the next 2 minutes or so. The Glasgow COP, led by Sir Alok, played a critical role in changing climate negotiations. It brought forward the scale, the pace, the money we needed for the green transformation. And it emphasized that this bill was too big for governments alone. MDBs needed to play a bigger role, SDRs too, and the private investors. And many at Glasgow rallied to Mark's call for arms at that COP. I see some people in the audience, Amar Bhattacharya, who was a leader of one of the expert groups set up, commissioned at COP26, who also pointed out, their reports pointed out, that if we're going to protect the planet, then we need to accelerate the green transformation in large emerging market economies. And this would require more money, this would require an acceleration that went beyond what would happen naturally and domestically, a real acceleration. But it would require a tremendous amount of capital inflows. The estimates are over $1 trillion per year. And whilst private capital flows are increasingly financing the green transformation in developed countries, those flows are not going south. That's partly because of what we might call micro risks, project risks, regulatory risks. But it can't just be that, because if we look around us, we're not seeing large southward flows even when there are no major micro risks. And that's because there are a large amount of perceived macro risks, country risks, credit risks, policy risks. And these combine with a risk aversion to mean that the cost of hedging foreign exchange is prohibitive for many investors. In the case of Brazil, it's often been over 10 percentage points. And that would mean that the return, the dollar currency return of a project in Brazil will go so low as you pay that cost of hedging that it takes that tide of capital we need and turns it into a trickle. And so we got reducing foreign exchange hedging costs as a part of the G20 and COP agendas last year. And over the last several weeks, teams by the Treasury Secretary Saron in Brazil, Ministry of Finance, and at the IDB have been working very hard on developing a new foreign exchange platform where projects in Brazil can offer dollar returns and dollars to suppliers without huge hedging costs. Now, the way it works and the way it would work best is by taking the risks that we need to hedge and putting them where they are better managed and held over time. Not transferring them somewhere that can't really manage them and therefore pile on risk premiums to give them the cushion against those risks. So, for example, projects should take project risks. Projects could also take, with their pricing formulas, ordinary inflation risks. Governments, the government of Brazil, with its fiscal rules and inflation target, can smooth macro risks faced by projects over time by offering to lend dollars whenever an exchange rate were to go way below what the policy framework is, which is consistent with the policy framework of fiscal rules and inflation targeting. And then a AAA-rated lender, like the IDB, can smooth the volatility of international capital markets, which often have an impact on local currency, which has nothing to do with what's happening domestically. And so project risks being held by the project. Governments helping to smooth out macro risk that those projects face. And the IDB, a AAA-rated lender, smoothing out the volatility of international capital markets that the government faces. And that allows projects to offer dollar returns and dollar to their suppliers without huge hedging costs. And to me and to you, I'm sure, it's no surprise that this Brazilian government, that this Ministry of Finance, that this Secretary of the Treasury, working with this IDB, have been working hard on developing this product. And so I'd like to ask the Secretary to the Treasury to tell us a little bit, share with us some of his own thoughts, personal thoughts and motivations and reflections on this new innovative product.
Bom, obrigado, boa tarde a todos. Acho que é consenso que todas as falas, né, a mudança climática impõe um padrão de aceleração de investimento rumo à transição para a economia de baixo carbono. Isso é consenso. É consenso também, como foi dito, que a necessidade de capital ela perpassa a capacidade dos governos, em especial em países emergentes, do setor público, lidar com esse desafio de investimentos. E pensando nesse contexto, né, e o papel que os países emergentes possuem no processo de redução de emissões, e em especial o Brasil, que não só tem um papel a cumprir, como tem uma grande oportunidade estratégica, né, por conta da sua matriz de energia limpa e do potencial de geração futura, que nós pensamos em um novo programa em conjunto com o BID, de criar uma plataforma de soluções que pudesse lidar com a questão da volatilidade cambial, do risco cambial. Como foi bem mencionado, a estabilidade macroeconômica desempenha um papel fundamental na redução do risco, tanto da volatilidade quanto do risco de desvalorização futura das moedas, né? O diferencial de taxa de juros só vai se resolver com a estabilização macroeconômica. Isso vale para qualquer economia emergente, vale para o Brasil, e nós estamos, como foi bem mencionado também, adotando medidas, o novo marco fiscal, reforma tributária, aprimoramentos na política monetária, todos eles no sentido de trazer mais previsibilidade, estabilidade macroeconômica para o país. Tudo isso está sendo endereçado. Mas, em paralelo, há a necessidade da atração e do aumento dos investimentos, ela é imediata. E, para que isso ocorra, de fato, nós construímos, e temos aí o orgulho de ter lançado nessa semana, uma semana emblemática para o Brasil, lançamos uma plataforma, o EcoInvest Brasil, que reúne um conjunto de medidas voltadas a facilitar a integração das companhias brasileiras e dos projetos feitos aqui no Brasil, acessarem o sistema financeiro internacional, captarem recursos em moeda forte, com segurança, assim como também criar condições para reduzir o risco dos investidores externos do país. Então, essas medidas envolvem, por um lado, uma linha de blended finance, que vai apoiar as companhias brasileiras a realizarem operações de dívida em dólar protegidas, com hedge cambial. Essa linha de blended finance, ela visa tornar o custo competitivo viável para essas companhias, fazer essa captação, integrar, trazer poupança externa para o Brasil, mas, ao mesmo tempo, também fazê-lo sem uma exposição cambial excessiva. Isso é uma parte importante da medida e vai ajudar muito a viabilizar projetos no Brasil, acessar funding externo para essa agenda. Uma outra linha vai apoiar que as instituições financeiras locais possam desenvolver produtos financeiros voltados ao hedge cambial, para resolver problemas específicos ou para ficarem mais confortáveis e tornar os produtos viáveis, para aumentar a oferta de produtos derivativos, de produtos de hedge cambial no Brasil. Aqui há uma dificuldade muito grande no mercado acima de 1, 2 anos, não há um mercado com liquidez ou com uma oferta abundante em horizontes acima de 5 anos. E uma parte desses problemas podem ser resolvidos, podem ser atenuados com essa linha, seja para reduzir o risco de crédito das instituições, seja para evitar chamadas de margens que muitas vezes afastam ou dificultam projetos que estão em fase pré-operacional, principalmente. Tem uma outra linha muito importante, que é uma linha de liquidez. Ela especialmente é importante para projetos de infraestrutura ou projetos que tenham uma correlação, ainda que parcial, com o câmbio, e projetos de infraestrutura, em geral, eles têm uma correlação a médio e longo prazo com o câmbio, e os eventos de estresse cambial, eles podem ser resolvidos por essa linha de liquidez. Isso não só vai dar segurança ao projeto, garantir que ele não vai ter um problema de fluxo de caixa, especialmente na fase pré-operacional, mas também o fato dessa linha estar disponível, nós vamos oferecê-las aos projetos estratégicos na agenda da transição, elas vão poder ajudar, em alguma medida, a reduzir o risco e, obviamente, o custo do crédito das operações de dívida para esses projetos, tendo essa garantia de que haverá a manutenção do desembolso em moeda forte. Então, é uma medida também muito importante que resolve um problema específico, assim como as outras duas resolvem problemas específicos. Uma quarta linha que também compõe esse leque de recursos financeiros para apoiar a atração de investimento é uma linha para a estruturação de projetos, com uma carência maior para que ela fique adequada a toda a fase de estudo, desenvolvimento do projeto e a fase pré-operacional do projeto. Então, uma linha que vai ter uma carência de 7 a 10 anos para o seu retorno. Então, isso facilita muito, isso ajuda muito. Ela vai ser usada especialmente para projetos que têm uma relação com a pauta exportadora na economia do baixo carbono, isso é importante. Então, nós vamos abrindo ali um conjunto de soluções que completam o ciclo todo e podem aí fazer toda a diferença na atração do investimento. De forma complementar a essas ações que são feitas pelo Tesouro Nacional, há a parceria com o BID para aquisição de instrumentos derivativos no mercado internacional e repassá-los ao Banco Central para distribuir em mercado, como foi comentado. Isso é uma medida importante também, vai ajudar a aumentar a oferta. Então, e para fechar esse conjunto de ações que, ao nosso ver, vai ajudar a aumentar a oferta de instrumentos de proteção cambial, vai aumentar a demanda por esses instrumentos, vai atrair mais investimentos, seja por parte das companhias captando recursos lá fora, no exterior, trazendo para o Brasil, seja atraindo investidores, né, o FDI vindo para o Brasil de fato. Nós temos também uma parceria com o BID para que toda a governança do programa seja feita com uma rede de parcerias, incluindo aí apoio de terceiros para acompanhar o programa, avaliar o programa e sugerir medidas de aprimoramento. Então, com tudo isso, nós estamos num momento muito feliz desse lançamento, muito contente por chegar nesse passo. Nós acreditamos que o Brasil, primeiro, vai conseguir com isso atrair mais recursos para projetos na área ambiental, na transição ecológica, é muito importante. Mas, mais do que isso, esse programa, uma vez bem sucedido, nós acreditamos que ele será, ele vai ser um case que pode ser replicado para outros países, outras economias emergentes também, que vão poder se utilizar desse conjunto de soluções. E é importante que ele seja um conjunto de soluções, eu acho que não é uma solução mágica, é um conjunto de medidas que podem ser tomadas para mitigar problemas específicos. Então, diferentes projetos vão ter diferentes dores, e é importante que nós tenhamos aí instrumentos para lidar com cada um deles. Com tudo isso, nós estamos aqui nessa semana aí muito otimistas que nós conseguimos dar um passo importante para tornar o país, para tornar o Brasil mais atrativo para o investimento privado. E nós vamos conseguir isso mobilizando o investimento privado doméstico e mobilizando o investimento privado internacional. Então, fico muito feliz aqui de estar a poder apresentar um pouco dos detalhes dessas medidas que foram tomadas essa semana. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much indeed. And let's also thank the very hard-working team that you have and the IDB has, who've been working very hard on this. I see Mario in the audience, and also Anderson and Rafael, Orlando and Eduardo, and Morgan, who are very important people as part of this effort. Alok, if I can turn to you now. So 3 years or so after that most critical turning point COP, what are, in your mind, the key sort of remaining problems we need to solve? And in terms of the emerging solutions you've seen, what are your thoughts on those?
Great. Thank you for that, Avi. So, look, friends, if I may just take a bit more of a helicopter vision on this. So, what kind of world are we facing right now? We've got huge headwinds that collectively are challenging us. You've got conflict around the world, and Avi, sort of since COP26, I'm afraid the geopolitical landscape has got a lot worse. Secondly, you still have the long shadow of COVID. Now, whilst countries have effectively come out of COVID, that has had a huge impact on balance sheets around the world. And the third is the issue of a worsening climate. I mean, you have countries, some of the most climate vulnerable countries that can least afford it across the world, that are having to spend 15% plus a year of GDP on dealing with climate vulnerabilities. That is, and by the way, that is going to get worse, because last year was the hottest year on record. We breached temporarily, I hope, the 1.5 degree target that was agreed in Paris. So we are facing some huge, huge challenges. Are countries responding? Yes, they are responding. We've seen at the various COPs, at COP26, 27, 28, there's been sort of progress being made going forward, and countries are setting out their plans for how do they deal with the climate challenge, their nationally determined contributions. And of course, going into COP30, you will see a revision of those NDCs from countries. But what you also know is that those NDCs are put together by countries on the basis of getting support, financial support. Some of it they can do with their own money, some of it they need financial support. And the big missing ingredient here, which is what we are all discussing, is finance. And it's not that the money is missing. I mean, you've heard from Mark Carney. We've launched GFANZ. I was at the launch of the Brazilian chapter yesterday with Mark. There's $150 trillion of assets on the balance sheets of the GFANZ members. That's great. But why is it not getting through, right? Where is the flow? And I think that is the problem that we face right now. Now, we had Kristalina and Ajay here earlier, both, in my view at least, sort of brilliant leaders. But it is the case that those multilateral organizations were set up to deal with the challenges of the 20th century. They were not set up to deal with the challenges of the 21st century. Now, it is changing, and you've heard from Ajay the changes that are being made, 45% of funding going to climate by 2030. For me, it was great to work with Kristalina when she was pushing forward on more SDRs coming forward. So that's all great. But one of the big challenges, I think, for this COP, for this G20, is to make sure we really push forward on MDB reform, and that actually does result in more money coming through. The second thing is the balance sheets and the fact that interest costs in the Global South are way higher than in the North. And we have to deal with debt sustainability as well. And the final thing is that how do you get more public, but on the back of that, private finance flowing? Now, I was very pleased to hear, Ajay was talking about the work going on with this private sector lab, and that's right. But we then need to see those solutions actually coming through. So then, coming down to some of the areas there that we could already make progress before we have sort of big reform. One, of course, is the work that you've done brilliantly on FX. I think you really need to be congratulated for that, and I think that sets the benchmark for where this can be done in other jurisdictions as well. The second is all the work that's been going on SDRs, rechanneling. And Avi, you will all know that Avi was advisor to Prime Minister Mia Mottley doing the Bridgetown agenda, and that was something that the Rockefeller team worked with very closely as well. So thank you for all of that. But the work coming out of that in terms of rechanneling is so important. If we could actually get rechanneling of SDRs and get governments actually committed to doing that through the IDB, through the African Development Bank, you would actually have a leverage effect, 1 to 4, 1 to 5 times. Why is that not happening? You did manage to get the debt resilience sustainability clause through, so that's great. And then I think that we've had this G20 review, this capital adequacy review, independent panel that has done this. Now, there are some reports out there that say that if you could just implement those reforms, never mind anything else, implement those reforms now, that is going to release almost another $200 billion of finance that could be used. So as well as the work that is going on through the G20 in terms of those big reform pieces on the MDBs, we actually also need to make sure that what is possible is being done right now. And so the final point I want to make is about the opportunity for Brazil, for your country, sir. And this is really, in my view, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, this is a moment in history, because we have to cut emissions by over 40% over the next 6 years if you want to keep alive limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. You have the leadership of the G20, you have the leadership of COP30, and making sure that particularly on the finance piece, you have that green thread running through the through G20, COP30, but then also in conversations with the G7 and other sort of big events that take place over the next couple of years, to have those as forcing mechanisms to get governments to do a lot more. From everything I've seen and heard over the last few days, I know that the Brazilian government is up to the task, and we're all there to help you. But this is a crucial moment, and I think this is a moment in history for Brazil.
Thank you very much, Alok. Let me try and reach some kind of conclusion to our panel. I think as human beings, we're not short of clever ideas. What we have to do is implement and accelerate. And I think we're seeing an emerging system. And I think was talked a little bit about that emerging system of finance coming through in today's panel. Innovative ways in which we can try and bring the private sector, especially around mitigation, dealing with some of the major risks they deal with, whether that is volatility risks or liquidity risks or credit risks that you talked about. And it's about using new innovative tools, as Alok was referring to, like SDRs, like debt clauses, like the capital of MDBs and expanding that capital in order to make countries more resilient. And I think we can see an emerging climate finance system. We need to accelerate it, we need to implement it, we need to learn and redouble our efforts. Please thank my two guests for their leadership, both today but also in the past. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Avinash, Secretary Seron, and Sir Alok Sharma for sharing with us such deep and meaningful words with us today. Now I want to introduce the second panel, and for that, I invite Mr. Anderson Caputo Silva, Connectivity, Markets and Finance Division Chief at the IDB, Mr. Winston Fritsch from PUC-Rio and the Climate Policy Initiative, His Excellency Ambassador Mahid Al-Suwaidi, Director General of COP28, Mr. Rodrigo Valdez, Western Hemisphere Department Director of the IMF, and Ms. Natalia Diaz, Director of BNDES, and also Mr. André Aquino from the Ministry of Environment and Climate of Brazil. So, welcome to all of you. A round of applause for our guests, our speakers, please. Anderson, as soon as everybody's ready, the word is yours, please.
Thanks, Adriana. Welcome, distinguished panelists. Today, as we have been discussing here, we're standing united in recognizing the importance of attracting both public and private investments to meet our ambitious climate and biodiversity goals. No? Building an institutional ecosystem, what we're going to be discussing here, no? That will support our collective aspirations for a sustainable future will require action and close collaborations from several actors, from the international finance community. It requires also the think tanks, governments, communities, and the private sector. We are very fortunate to have in this panel a great combination here, no, of views that will give us different perspectives on this challenge. No? I want to start then the first question and direct the question of the panel to Ambassador Al-Suwaidi. Ambassador, can you tell us, no, about your perspective from your experience as director of COP28? What are the key bottlenecks and risks hindering international capital from flowing to fund sustainable investments in emerging markets? No? So how do you envision the role of the international community in leveling this playing field for increasing climate finance international flows?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's wonderful to be in Sao Paulo, in this beautiful country. And of course, I'm very excited for COP30 that's going to be here. As all of you probably know, one of the outcomes of COP28 was that we had this troika that would be working between the UAE, the Azerbaijan and Brazilian presidency, and we already had an announcement about that a week ago. And so we're excited that we're going to be working with our Brazilian colleagues to tackle these very issues. As you know, COP28 was a great success because we were able to bring together the private sector, civil society, and the negotiators to come with really solid outcomes. And why was it so important? It's because we had the global stocktake and we needed to deliver action to get us back on track to 1.5 degrees. And that didn't come easy. We did a listening tour where we traveled around the world and we came to places like Brazil and spoke with different investors, different people in indigenous people, civil society. We spoke to everybody. And when we did that travel around the world, we learned a few things, but the main thing we learned was that finance is neither available, affordable, or accessible in many cases. And that one of the key things that we needed to do was to solve for this challenge. And we know that many of those challenges come from, and what we heard from previous speakers in the previous panel, the need to reform the international financial institutions. We need to see significant reform happening there. We need to have a better framework for how we're discussing climate finance, and that was one of the key outcomes that I would really encourage you all to look at that came out of COP28 was our finance framework, that I think a lot of people underestimate how powerful this is, because it brings together the different negotiating tracks when it comes to finance, from Bridgetown, from what was happening in Paris, what's happening at the G20, what's happening in the World Bank, IMF discussions, under one discussion. And then what we need in addition to that is more capital. We are just not seeing capital getting to particularly the global south, particularly the developing world. And that is because a whole list of issues that are often around regulatory environments, currency risk, all sorts of different types of issues that are preventing capital from getting. And so our final contribution to try and help that was the creation of this 30 billion fund called Altera that was announced by our president. This fund, we hope, can raise 250 billion by 2030. And because of its scope, that it can invest globally, but is focused on the global south, has the scale of trying to raise 250 billion, and then this unique structure of having a 25 billion acceleration fund that can really push finances around the world, but particularly to the global south, and a 5 billion fund that is more catalytic, that can take on more risk. We hope that we can really show a model that investing in countries like Brazil makes economic sense, and investing in climate makes even better economic sense. And so through those types of models, we can really crowd in the private sector, because fundamentally that's what we need. We need the private sector to come in a big way to deliver the capital that we're going to need, the estimates of 6 trillion, 7 trillion of capital that we need to achieve our 1.5 degree goals, and that's what we have to stay focused on.
Thank you so much. I wanted to tell everyone that I could not think of a better way to start this, no? The way that we're organizing the discussion here, because we are starting, with this intervention of Ambassador Al-Suwaidi, that just comes to us with these findings from COP28, and then setting the stage on this, the overall holistic approach and what is being discussed. And we are going here to gradually zoom in into a specific aspects for Brazil. No? But before going that, and another very important step is then ask a question here to Rodrigo. No? Because Rodrigo being from the IMF, as the managing director was mentioning in the opening speech, there are a lot of actions that the IMF is taking to see how to facilitate flows, how to make it faster. But what is important always in the perspective of the IMF is how you mitigate financial stability risks in doing so. So Rodrigo, it will be wonderful to hear your perspective from the IMF, how the institution is looking at this.
Thank you first, Anderson, for the invitation to the ADB. This is very important for everybody. Let me try to divide my answer to the question in two. One is sort of bread and butter IMF. And for bread and butter, I mean our all work on macro financial stability. And then I want to go on specifics in climate, what is happening at the fund on this. Probably you know we engage with countries through surveillance, the famous Article 4 consultation. There is a year process with all countries. That's in the Articles of Agreement of the fund. And that's a platform that is very useful to discuss policies. Then we have capacity development, very large centers for capacity development, and programs. The third line of work of the fund, probably the one that is most known of, is programs. Those three lines, at the end of the day, are geared toward promoting financial macro stability and shared growth. And therefore, to me, the first line of defense at the end to tackle the problems that we are having is to have adequate macro policies. If you can do all the financial arrangements, engineers, tools, but if the macro is under stress because you did poorly in the policy side, there's not a lot to do. Of course, this is not sufficient, and we recognize fully that there is a lot more to do, but it's a necessary condition. Let me give you one example, because we have seen this very important development on FX risk and this program that was just commented before. But let's think, where is that risk coming from at the end of the day? There is part of that risk that is just reality, shocks. If you go to Australia or if you go to Canada, there is FX risk there. But it's not the same risk that we have in an emerging market. Why is that? Well, basically because policies and the way macro is run is very different. So we can think as an extra layer that we're overreactive to the same shocks. Why is that? Again, because macro policies are not the best. And then you have this low probability of a big tail event, a big problem. Again, many times through vulnerabilities that macro policies have produced. So bottom line on this is that it's very important not to forget about these macro basics while we work the other part. That is super important. That is new tools, new ideas. In terms of more climate now, and this is my second point, climate is even each day more important, I would say, more prominent in our work. We have a lot of new data, new analytical work. Part of the surveillance discussions is climate. With the big emitters is an obligation, it's policy now. Probably you know the FSAPs, the financial assessment, for the financial sector assessment program that we do for countries. Then they have a module on climate risks. We have financial diagnostics, macro-fiscal diagnostics. So this is really part of the day-to-day. Final point, I want to give a bit more flavor of this Resilience and Sustainability Facility, the RSF. This is very different from the typical balance of payment support program that we do. This is a new facility that's being used for an increasing number of countries. I will give you examples in a sec, but let me give you some flavor of this. It's a 20-year line, so it's very different from the typical short-term balance of payment line. It has a 10-year of grace period for capital, 10.5 years. It has very affordable interest rates. They basically pass-through SDR rates. About 3/4 of the membership of the fund, of the almost 200 countries can apply. One thing that is important is it has to be used in parallel to an IMF program. So it's not alone. Why? Because, again, the bread and butter for us is to keep the macro in check. And final point is that it has quite a bit of conditionality, but it's conditionality on climate or on the resilience that we are thinking, no? It could be used for other objectives, like health. That work, and here I finished, is very important. How to produce that matrix of conditionality, for which we have to say, I thank really strongly the ADB and the World Bank, because they work with us in producing that matrix. And the interesting thing is that you get the Ministry of Finance involved on this. Typically, Ministry of Finance is very important in a country. When you have it around climate, it produces, it trickles internal dynamics in countries that are super important. Anyway, that's the RSF. We have with Jamaica, we have with Barbados, we have with Costa Rica, and recently with Paraguay, this program, and they are working pretty well. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. I really liked the bread and butter type of thing, because it fits so nicely to the idea here that in terms of creating the enabling conditions for the capital to flow, like this bread and butter is super important, no? To create like the macro stability, no? So that the capital can flow, and actually it reduces the cost in the end of any hedging alternative, as Avinash was mentioning here, the relevance of macro when we think at the costs that is there, no? When we try to hedge. But that fits so nicely to like shifting to Winston, and also Winston coming to Brazil, the perspective of Brazil, no? What do you consider in Brazil are the main barriers to attract long-term capital, And then I would like to link to what Secretary Ceron mentioned here. We were discussing, like he was describing about the Eco-Invest program. You know? Do you think the Eco-Invest program addresses those barriers so that we can actually attract capital to Brazil?
My short answer is yes, indeed. My long answer will take 6 minutes. I think this is nice because, as Larry Summers, the American economist, say, the cheapest economic policy is to change expectations. I mean, if a good macroeconomist, if you have policies that immediately impact expectations, this is cheap. And this program has very little demand on public money. I mean, I think, as far as I understand, the main piece of legislation, at least it was announced, is a medida provisória that's going to be sent to Congress, which I read it, has very little fiscal impact. So it's absolutely consistent with the macroeconomic framework that the government is using. So this is very interesting, and it affected already expectations. I've been getting calls from fellow bankers, I mean, people that I know in the financial sector in Brazil and abroad. And this thing, with 24 hours of announcement, has already affected expectations, or at least curiosity. Because it has to be curiosity, because this is an open canvas. This is not one of those ready-made pacotes, as we say in Brazil. This is an invitation to the private sector to join in a common endeavor to solve a fundamental political, economic policy problem of Brazil and of all developing countries. For Brazil, for me today, which I'm, as you can see, a pretty old economist, is amazing because we have, over $350 billion of reserves. Our current account balance is projected. The worst case scenario will be less than 2% deficit. Our current trade balance has peaked. It's over $100 billion, and nobody, the new normal is 80. Brazil is going to be one of the biggest oil exporters in 3 or 5, 6 years, within the 3 or 4 biggest. So, it's very strange that Brazil is still on the league that, as was explained by all the participants, international banks put these bad debtors. I'll come back to that in a minute, but this is, I like the program because of its invitation to solve a problem, but it creates, obviously, things. And first, it has the two things that a good policy announcement has to have. One is consistent with economic policies that the government has in the environmental world, in the transition world. It's absolutely consistent with the Green Deal that this government has put forward. It's a piece of the thing. It's not even the biggest piece, but it's a fundamental piece, especially for large capital-intensive projects. And the second is that it addresses this problem that I won't repeat it because Professor Persaud and others have addressed, because foreign exchange risk is the biggest thing in the ball game of attracting foreign private investment, which is important because given the immensity of the investment challenge, there's no way that public and domestic savings will fulfill the gap. So it's a need to attract. But how? People that, like me, have been in investment banking for 20 years in Brazil know that. I try to finance several projects in Brazil. And there is this big problem. And the problem can be decomposed in two. One is volatility, and this package, the plan, the Eco-Invest plan, addresses one of them, which is volatility, which in Brazil actually is already helped a bit because inflation is indexed in 1 year interval. So it's not that bad, but it has an effect. And they have very clear two ideas. One can be implemented immediately, which is a liquidity facility, which is very important for projects to address volatility. The other is this open lab to discuss derivatives. And to see the central bank working hand in hand with the Treasury, it's an idea that this thing is sound in fiscal terms, given the typical behavior of the central bank in things that may affect government expenditures in Brazil. Now, there's another problem, which is the big wedge that increases the cost of capital, which has to do with sovereign credit risk, rating, Brazil rating. Okay, the rating, which is very high because, I mean, we haven't been behaving very well in the last 15 or since the recession, the global recession. And this is a big problem because it's not easy to solve. And there are no instruments suggested in the plan how to do that, obviously, besides the well-done macro policy, which will solve this problem if it's delivered over time with the help of a much better dynamically external position. But this is not addressed, and I think this is, I'll come back to that in a minute. But I think there are two things that I need to be added to this plan, which I repeat is an open canvas, an obra aberta, as we say. One is this, I mean, how to address currency risk. Besides good macro, you have to take 3-4 years to make the miracle again of investment grade, if helped by the world economy, by the way. That can be addressed, I think, because this is a tail risk. And a tail risk, the premium, I mean, it's an insurance problem. It's not a derivative problem. I think it's an insurance problem. And this can be addressed. And I think that's something the government should try to do that. Try to get the lab to work on that. Okay, this is important, especially in forecast of better macro and balance of payment conditions. The premium might fall, will fall. So this is important. And the other maybe is to increase the scope of the program beyond energy transition. This is very much a program that is important for big projects, transition projects. But we have two other areas which are important. I mean, for instance, adaptation investments, which is a fraction of what Brazil can do in energy investment, which, by the way, is not for the domestic markets, for generating inputs which will eventually be exported. But I think that to look at something additional to that, especially for adaptation, is important because the nature of adaptation requires, if with creativity, be done with public-private sector partnership. So private money, that's the new vision of adaptation investment. Private money can be attracted, obviously. I mean, the real estate sector loves it. If the government creates a special area of, because it's different than this one. I mean, I think it has to be additional, but don't forget adaptation, which I don't think is very much addressed in this program. Last but not least is the question of nature-based solutions, for two reasons, I think. First, the economics of a project in nature-based solutions is entirely different from an energy, big green hydrogen project, for many reasons. First, because the technological risk is much lower, believe it or not, on the big projects, because they're more engineered in a way, and have been, it's not so much tailor-made as most of nature-based solution projects are. The size is different, and the risk is very different. This is nature-based solution. Let me talk about reforestation, good quality reforestation, which very nice firms in Brazil are beginning to invest seriously. This has different risks, okay? But they're very attractive to foreign money, but maybe not now for that money. I mean, it must be more equity, very blended debt finance. And it requires other kinds of regulatory arrangements which in Brazil have to do with land use and things like that. So I think the project is, and I conclude here, is very timely, very well done, has to be complemented, is an open canvas, and the complementation, in my view, is one in instruments. Go for the tail risk. Try to do that, which is not there yet. And that's fundamental. And the two additions to make something nice. And now I talk to Mr. Seron, who I can see is behind the screen here. Seron, have a look at tail risk, have a look at adaptation, and concoct something as intelligent as that, but different for the nature-based solution sector, which is, I think, another fantastic opportunity for Brazil in terms of competitiveness, besides green energy. Obrigado.
Thank you very much. Very enlightening and encouraging to start now in making this link and starting with a clear yes, that it addresses several of the bottlenecks, but also a lot of food for thought to start. But one thing that I get in this discussion is there are two elements here. One is how just by announcing and showing that in the announcement there is meat, there is a concrete program. There is a study that I actually invite all to access the website of the Brazilian Treasury. There is a whole study explaining how this will work, what are the different lines, the justification, the costs that exist, the rationale to creating them. So it's a very it's a work that really clarify a lot of this very complex discussion. But what I get here is two things in this discussion. One, this point of just by announcing and with meat there, it's incredible the amount of demand that you already generate. The numbers of calls and questions and interest that this has generated from different fronts, from investors, from banks, from different countries that are already looking that if that works, that's something I would like to replicate. So that is number one, the expectations issue is very important. The second point is that it's a program that looks like in a no silver bullet type of solution, right? It's a program that comes just by having 4 different lines, and then you have the derivatives on the other side. You see that it is a program that tries to tackle both the demand and the supply sides at the same time and creating the enabling environment. So that point of no silver bullet to the solution and that you need to tailor different types of projects, you look for a solution, I think it's an important aspect. And I think that the way you answered, you were almost addressing each of those aspects. But now, we cannot just shifting, as I mentioned, to a more specific angle. We are already in Brazil, and then we cannot not bring BNDES into the picture, and Natalia, that we have been already we're already very good friends, let me say, that we have been working a lot together, the IDB and BNDES just recently, and we announced at COP an action plan for the Green Coalition, which was an initiative that the IDB and BNDES were proponents, and includes 17 development banks in the Amazon region from 6 countries, and also 3 international partners that besides the IDB, the World Bank, and CAF are there. So there is a lot there that we're already doing, and I know that this goes beyond Amazonia. Now we have a big program that is about to be implemented in Amazonia, pro-Amazonia. But I would like to hear what is BNDES thinking in terms of innovation, trying to do both in the Amazonia, but more generally. Natalia.
No, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with a few colleagues on the audience and here at the panel, and just to discuss how we can scale up and expedite financing to emerging economies. And I think this is going to be the crucial discussion that we have to have this year. And one of the issues that we need to take into consideration is climate finance is not even subdued in terms of the total volume, but it's also not being equally distributed among the regions. And if we take emerging economies, they are only getting 15% of all the financial flows that are now reaching the trillion scale last year. So what we need to factor in and to start discussing is how we can channel the funds to these markets, especially because they represent 1/3 of the global GDP, and that's where 2/3 of the global population lives. So it is fundamental to have this discussion. We take many emerging markets, and Brazil is one example, that we see countries that they have comparative advantages that can be turned into competitive advantages, but the window of opportunity is very, very small. And I'm talking about Brazil. We know that we are abundant in natural resources, in critical minerals, in the reserves of biodiversity and water, because we have a clean energy matrix, one of the cleanest among the G20. But for us to expedite, we need to be facing the key detractor to our development, which is the cost of capital, and that's why this discussion is super important. We spoken on the previous panels on how we need to reform the global financial architecture, but I want to make an emphasis on the point that Winston Frisch brought, which is really to review the credit ratings of public development banks. And I'm speaking about BNDES and several other colleagues that are here, because we are very important vehicles, not only to localize the SDGs, but also to fast forward the implementation of the green agenda on a global basis. We know we have sight of public policy, we know how to structure projects, we know how to measure externalities, and we do have access to different pools of liquidity and capital that we need to access to implement that agenda. So, and that's what BNDES has been doing. I think the Brazilian government, first of all, is doing a very good job in trying to tackle some of the issues that we face, expediting the regulation on important sectors like the carbon markets, the green hydrogen, or putting together the economic acceleration package, which outlines the priority projects for the government, putting together the plan for ecological transformation, and more recently, coming up with this mechanism to reduce the cost of hedging, which is very, very crucial to attract cross-border investments into Brazil. So we, BNDES, as an instrument of implementation of the public policy, we therefore interact with the government and try to align our priorities in terms of asset allocation to enable the policies that the Brazilian government has been developing. So, we have been focusing a lot on how we can deploy, on how we can access different and more competitive funding, and that's why the revision of the global rating systems is important, because we have, irrespectively of the soundness of our balance sheet, we are capped at the sovereign rating of Brazil, which does not take into consideration the forward-looking approach that we will implement, that will take into consideration the ESG factors in coming up with the rating. So we tend to focus on the key segments: infrastructure, small and medium-sized companies, innovation, and we are very much aligned with the government and talking to other governments to attract productive investments to Brazil, to take into consideration the clean matrix that we have and make Brazil as an export hub of green projects on a global basis. And that's potentially the single largest opportunities that we have to see that window of opportunity which the climate challenge poses in front of us. The second one, as Winston also mentioned, is the nature-based solutions, and that's where our engagement in the Amazon provides a lot of insights into that. So BNDES has always been known by fostering the sustainable development in the region. We are the managers of the Amazon Fund, and this year, one of the key measures that we have taken once we took office, President Mercadante took office, was to reinstate the Amazon Fund, and we have raised a lot of capital and invested a lot of the resources in some very important areas like security and others, and I will leave my colleague from MMA to comment a little bit on that. But we also launched, as Anderson spoken, the Green Coalition. The Green Coalition was an initiative that recognizes that it's not only enough to save the trees or the forests, we need to take into consideration the people that live in the Amazon region, 28 million people that live there, and we need to come up with economic alternatives for the people that live there, and we need to think about global solutions or regional solutions for the region, and rethink the instruments that are available to finance the Amazon. So we, for instance, invested in a blended finance instrument, the Amazon Biodiversity Fund, which is a combination of catalytic resource from the philanthropy and also matching with our commercial resource to accelerate startups in the region, which is just one example. And I think that we and the IDB, we have been discussing how we can create more flexible mechanisms to fast forward also the development in the region. The other initiative, of course, that we launched at COP which I think is the single largest or most simpler initiative that we launched at COP, which is the Restoration Arc for the Amazon, which is really a plan to recover 6 million hectares up until 2030 and recover land and create alternatives for the people that live in the Amazon. We came up with this area where we see that the forest has the biggest potential to restore itself, to have an impact on climate and on the population. And this is one initiative that we will be showcasing on an international scale because, of course, I mean, the investment that is needed is $10 billion. It's massive. I think that the greatest compliment that we had is that the international community acknowledged that the calculations are right because it is expensive to plant trees, but it's the simple technology that we have. And we need to come up with all the means that we have to expedite that. Lastly, I think we cannot forget the role that capital markets have and the private markets can have to fast forward the development agenda that we have been talking here. And here in Brazil, BNDESPAR, which is the arm of the BNDES that fosters investments in equity investments here in Brazil, we have been thinking how we can fast forward and crowding the private sector by investing through funds where we limit our participation up to 25% of the capital so that we can make sure that we're crowding the private sector and to deploy funds in the segments that we need mostly to advance the agenda. So there are multiple initiatives that we have been discussing, but again, I think that we need as a society to not only rethink how we are going to see and face the dialogue and how we can strengthen the roles of the public development banks for us to be an effective vehicle to implement the ambition that we have as a country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. It was really like a very comprehensive answer because you started like coming with the fact that the flows are not coming south, and then touched on a point that is quite critical. How can you then bring these flows at affordable levels? Because at the end of the day, what you need to do is also to then land in an affordable level, and then all these other like mechanisms of blended financing and bringing capital markets, because that's really like through capital markets that you can do these billions to trillions. Otherwise, it's very difficult to do. But then now, you also mentioned like the role of BNDES as an implementation arm because of policies. Behind all this, there is the policy making. So let's go to the policy making and invite André to tell us, like André, what do you consider to be the role of an emerging market country in terms of public policy development? What policies are being put in place to foster like the nature-based solutions that was mentioned here, types of investments, and how can it be done to enhance geographical coverage and social inclusion, which is also very important?
Okay. Boa tarde. Good afternoon, everyone. Great pleasure to be here and great to hear so much about nature-based solutions, which is what I'm going to focus on. So we heard about the transition, the ecological transition plan. I'd like to focus a little bit on what we believe to be one of the most powerful solutions to what we are discussing here, tropical forests, right? And I think it's never enough to re-emphasize Brazil holds the largest tropical forests in the world, which is protected by a vast network of protected areas, indigenous reserves, and we have a very advanced forest code that tries to reconcile agriculture, livestock production with forest protection. Now, in addition to this, our government, President Lula, as it has been repeated several times, has a commitment to halting deforestation by 2030. And we are very proud to announce that deforestation in the Amazon has already been reduced by 50% as of last year, and we will continue working on that. Now, the Ministry of Environment, working very closely with the Ministry of Finance, National Treasury, BNDES, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we have been trying to mobilize innovative finances through regulations, through the creation of new markets for ecosystem assets, carbon markets being one of them, but not the only one. We are also working on what we in Portuguese call the cotas de reservas ambientais, which is basically a tradable right for your excess native forest, natural forest on your property, and direct funds mobilization. Our minister has been very proactive in reaching out to investors and our sovereign partners, right? We have a goal of restoring 12 million hectares of degraded land. This is massive, and we need all hands on deck here. Now, from the Ministry of Environment, we are trying to put in place regulations that attract private sector. One, private sector financing. One of them is PPPs, right? So we have been working on extending what we now do on natural forests and parks. We work with the IADB on this and BNDES. In structuring concessions on degraded areas, in protected areas, for restoration. So we believe, and actually we know for a fact, that there is a lot of interest from the private sector in that. We are also trying to facilitate partnerships between landholders and private investors by reducing legal risks, by clarifying rights, including to carbon, and by basically sometimes just really linking supply and demand of money to land available. More at the global scene, as some of you know, at COP28, Brazil announced a new concept, what we call the Tropical Forests Forever Fund. It's a very ambitious initiative under discussion. Basically, Brazil is trying to mobilize, Brazil and its tropical country partners with whom we are discussing and sharing this concept, is trying to mobilize around $250 billion of sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, institutional investors, into a fund which would actually issue AAA, AA bonds, and that deposit, that investment would then be invested in higher investment, higher risk investment options. That difference, which we call excess returns, would then be used to reward tropical forest countries for maintaining their forest cover or increasing restoration. This may sound like carbon markets, but it's not. This is not linked to carbon. The matrix is not carbon. We are trying to do something that would be way simpler, forest cover. We now have technology. Brazil is very proud of having technology. Other countries have technology to report on forest cover, right? The idea is that then these funds would be the decision, of course, of sovereign countries how to use, but there is a strong expectation that those stewards of forest, like indigenous people and landowners that have forests on their land, would be rewarded. So this is something we are working hard on. We expect this could be launched at COP30. Let's see. Just two last points on geography, right? Geographic coverage. Here, I'm not from the financial sector. The only one thing I would say is these instruments cannot be geography agnostic. What I mean is it makes a big difference where you are investing, right? So in Brazil, for instance, we have a clear emphasis, of course, on bioeconomy in the Amazon. So we need funds going there. BNDES just mentioned this. And other, right? Cerrado, for instance, restoration of the Cerrado is Cerrado is our tropical savanna, is a critical need now. Inclusion, this is the hallmark of our current government. So what I would like to say is that we talked about carbon markets, all of that. Let's not forget the safeguards, social safeguards, carbon rights, and ensure that those that hold the rights are the ones getting the benefits. Brazil, we are working on legislation for that. And then the last is this concept of bioeconomy that we, at the G20, along with other ministries, we have a whole bioeconomy initiative. And one aspect that the government of Brazil emphasizes in this bioeconomy is traditional knowledge and ensuring that those indigenous people, traditional communities, would reap benefits from the monetization of these assets. Thanks.
Thank you, Andre. Andrea, thank you very much. I had asked you a question about policies, but you brought much more than that. And then I think that relates to what we heard from Mark Kearney, that things are so connected like the picture, like to get these answers, because you already came up with an innovation that you're bringing now with this fund, and I'm actually quite interested in learning more. We should talk about it, no? What I think too is that you mentioned about like a project preparation, like the PPPs, and that may actually be a topic that would relate to the ECO, no? Invest program, because you have a project preparation also facility, no? That can actually be bringing some of these solutions, no? So in that, I wanted to tell everyone, like, we don't have a lot of time, but we do have time to ask each of the panelists for a final takeaway. This is the challenge, no? Of in 2 minutes, no? What do you think will be like the critical lessons that we're hearing here to improve the ecosystem and really have this like flows really coming, no? South, no? And then I will start with Winston. I'll change the order a bit here, because Winston, I think that what we just heard, like you mentioned about nature-based solutions, too, etc. But it's your final takeaway, no? What would you tell us in 2 minutes that you think is critically important from this discussion?
I think I'll underline my 6 minutes presentation with 3 things. First, you should consider this program as a starting point, as an open canvas, and you only succeed if the private sector buys it. It's an apple, an incentive thrown by the more aggressive, the more visionaire private bankers. The second is it has to be replicated. It has to be exported. This is something that Brazil is innovating. I think it should be looked at as a new football, a new coffee, things that are associated with Brazil. I mean, Brazil started that. But this is certainly something which is even more fundamental to other countries. But it's not to be something that's open for all. Obviously, I think the IMF even may have some role to play in the accession of countries to these facilities, because this is something that has to do with underlying some fundamentalist macro policies. Last but not least, I think that what I said about expanding this program, and not expanding the program, actually making something on the lines of the program, but in different policy packages, is to admit that this is much more important for debt rather than equity, to big projects rather than small projects, to changing the productive structure of the end-use sector. And then you have to look into new areas which are fundamental of adaptation. And then you have PPPs. I mean, it's also a plea for the private sector. To increase private sector in adaptation is important and possible if you are creative. And last but not least, the nature-based solutions, which are a different ball game, but a very important ball game for Brazil.
Critically important, and I actually invite all to stay to the next two, because we are going to shift from the institutional discussions to actual examples, no? And then it will be a super interesting discussion. But I wanted to just like tell something. You mentioned about replication, no? And then I think that for us, like on the part of the IDB, like in teaming up with Brazil and developing this together, this is what is in our mind since the beginning, no? Because we're looking to like in our case, the whole Latin America, but we know with our partners, World Bank and others, no? So that this could be replicated elsewhere and adapted, no? It needs to be tailored, that is said. But let me, like for final remarks of Ambassador, also Adi, like what would be your final remarks after this discussion?
Well, first of all, it's been very interesting to hear the insights from these distinguished panelists. And I think that what I learned from COP28 in particular was that we can't do business as usual. You know, we know that the Paris Agreement was a massive milestone. But what the Global Stocktake told us that we weren't on track, and that we aren't on track still, only 2 months out of COP to achieve 1.5, but the COP28 made a huge leap in getting us back on track. And now we need to be vigilant. We need to be constantly looking at how we're measuring and making sure that we're performing. That's importantly on finance. How are we breaking down some of these barriers? And we can't be thinking business as usual. When we talk about IFI reform, it can't wait. It has to happen now. When we talk about mobilizing the private sector, it can't wait. It has to happen now. If you think about the goal of achieving 1.5, less than 1.5 by 2030, that's 7 years away, less than 7 years away now. And any decision or investment or policy that's going to impact those trajectories has to happen now. And that's why meetings like the G20 and this are so important, because we need to start to think in very practical, pragmatic, and honest conversations with the public, with policymakers, with governments about the things that we can do realistically to get us back on track and to reducing our impact on the climate.
Ambassador, I could not agree more. We are not in a business as usual environment. No? And in this Eco-Invest program, actually, we, as we were working closely, there was this question, this problem of exchange rate risk has been there forever. And then there was a lot of discussions and questions that got, why is this time different? No? And one thing that is different is the urgency, and that is making everybody act and think together and try to find a solution. It cannot be business as usual. So thank you very much for your final remark. Let me turn to Rodrigo in terms of, Rodrigo, final remarks from the perspective of IMF, lessons learned.
It's very difficult to have a quick sort of one conclusion from what we're doing, but I think we need several things at the same time. You have to work all the institutions, coordinate, private sector, et cetera, et cetera. And in that regard, let me tell you that this RSF is producing a space to discuss in a coordinated way, more solutions, more tools. We convene at the end many people at the same time to the same table, including the private sector. That has been very useful for that. And let me give you one example of what the RSF didn't produce directly, because the fund doesn't have the mandate to produce these new tools, new arrangements that are needed. But we can provide the platforms for the private sector and MDBs and governments to work together. In Barbados, they use part of the money of the RSF to basically have a new blue-green investment bank. So they are basically catalyzing the money of the RSF. They are inviting others to put some capital, and basically the $10 million that we started could become $250 after all the process. No? So there's a lot to do in terms of this improving, making less money, more money. Final point, I think we need to always remember that the private sector requires to get the capital back and the return back. And we need to recognize that as a very basic thing and to work through the different risks that they face. In our region, too often we have seen changes in rules that put in danger that. So I think one step that we have to work more is how we have rules that are easy to understand, and especially people have confidence that they will be there after some time.
Yeah, very, very also enlightening comment, because coming from the IMF, always that angle of that was so important to have this type of safety for the investment to flow. But what I find fascinating too is also the not a business as usual type of approach, because with the RSF, a whole new thinking also on the IMF on what else to do. And then the RSF is a great example of adding to the toolkit in a not business as usual fashion. So now, thank you very much. And Natalia, what would be your final thoughts?
Well, as I mentioned, I think that we need to put financing at the center of the discussion this year. So this has to be the financing year. we need to make sure that we include emerging markets on the discussion, and we acknowledge that the size and the importance will be relevant in the discussion going forward. We need perhaps to move the mindset from seeing this transition as a risk and rather as an opportunity. But in order to fulfill the potential of the opportunity, then it will require a coordinated effort from different stakeholders, being the public sector, the private sector, for us to advance in that agenda. So I think the challenge is huge, but we can do that. And it is an opportunity for us to change the pattern on how we have developed the world so far and how we can have a new basis for including more people and promoting the just transition going forward.
Thank you, Natalia. And getting all these actors involved, I think one thing that is very exciting is when you go to COP, for example, and you see how COP became like the event, right? With all these different actors there and trying to coordinate and making the flow happen. No? So this is, I think that I'm optimistic that the stars are aligning, no? for that to happen. So Andrea, final thoughts from you.
Well, if the stars are aligned, let's keep this sense of urgency really in our heart. I'll say something. I remember so well, I think it was in 2006, Stern report, right? Very clear that tackling deforestation was the cheapest, co-benefits, biodiversity, water, everything. Still, we are struggling, really putting in place a mechanism. We have the Amazon Fund, and we are extremely proud of the Amazon Fund, and we've done a lot with the Amazon Fund, but the needs are enormous. The opportunity costs of forests are enormous. It's big, and it's getting bigger because pressure from agriculture is increasing. So I think, it's really time for us to try to get the funding at scale out there to the right actors and not make the perfect the enemy of the doable. We have spent so much time already trying to build the carbon markets, and every day we are discussing the rules of the game. I keep joking. With carbon markets, it's like those kids. They only discuss the rule of the game and they forget to ever play it, right? Because we are always changing and new methodologies and new standards. High integrity, all of that, sure. But it needs to start. These funds need to start flowing. So let's use this G20 opportunity in Brazil to really get some of these scale initiatives working. Thanks.
I truly hope so, Andrea. I wanted to tell everyone, first, thank very much the panelists for these insightful contributions. Huh? We started by saying that this was a panel that would bring different perspective, and it really did. No? From COP, very thoughtful points from Winston, the IMF, that has expanded a lot the action, this direction, BNDES, Andrea with all the policies and plans of financial innovation. So this was really, really enlightening, and I think that a key lesson here is that you actually need all these perspectives together to create the ecosystem that's needed to move capital in a much faster and urgent pace. No? So I wanted to finish here with this remark, but asking everyone for a round of applause for the panelists.
Thank you to all our panelists for the insightful discussion. We have to skip our coffee break because we are ahead of time and we need to stick to the agenda, but coffee will be served at the very end of our event down the ramp, and you are more than welcome to join us at the end of the event. So now, as soon as the stage is free, we'll move on with our schedule. Okay. Our next panel is on financial innovation for climate change mitigation and adaptation, with a focus on concrete, scalable cases. Concrete cases allow us to focus, learn, and showcase the potential of this approach to mobilize resources for sustainable investments. I invite to the stage Mr. Ivan Oliveira from the Ministry of Finance of Brazil. Mr. Applause, please, please. Mr. Fernan Kamanzi from Rwanda Development Bank. Ms. Carola Moreno from the Ministry of Finance of Chile. Mr. George Guild from Banco do Brasil. And Mr. Gabriel Azevedo from IDB Invest, representing the IDB Group. Welcome. And Ivan, as soon as you're ready, the floor is yours.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. I'll move to English for the benefit of our discussions. And let me first thank IDB for this event. I think it's great to be here, just by the G20 meetings and really talking about something that is really critical for our G20 agenda. And thank you for being here. You know, this is the best panel of the day. So those of you that are here, you're about to see something interesting. And interesting because, and then that's why I think this is really important for our G20 agenda. We really try to frame the agenda in a way that we could go to the specifics. We could really try to deliver something. Not just recommendations and a bunch of papers that would add to, and we've been trying hard to really be as much as possible connected to the reality and helping frame new instruments, new institutions that could help out developing countries, especially developing countries, in dealing with transitioning. So, and IDB has been a key player, in fact, in that sense. And we're going to talk about, in this panel, about specific cases and instruments that were used in different contexts that were innovative, were really something new. And again, it is absolutely well connected to the agenda that we have there at the G20 within the Sustainable Finance Working Group that I lead from the Ministry of Finance. So one of the priorities that we have there is exactly the idea of dealing with nature-based solutions financing, but going to specific cases that were successful in different contexts, small islands, Brazil, Africa, Asia, and really getting to know how the instruments and take the instruments out and maybe creating within the group a toolbox of good and replicable instruments in similar contexts. So really helping out countries in framing their own new programs and projects, even to access green funds, and access to green funds and streamlining access to green funds is another priority that we have in the G20, for example. So I'm really happy to be here with you. And I'd like to give the floor first to Gabriel from IDB Invest. And Gabriel, I think it would be quite interesting to see what we have in terms of expertise. And you know, IDB has been playing a very critical role, really leading the agenda on innovative instruments in the region, but connecting climate and nature. That again, nature is part of our G20 agenda. It's a way that we're framing, you know, connecting to other perspectives other than just mitigation and adaptation. And I think it connects well to the agenda of this event itself, that is climate and development. So what are the instruments or cases that you'd like to bring to the audience that we've seen IDB Invest playing a key role and would be interesting to bring to debate? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Van, and it's a pleasure to be here with the other panelists and you know, with this great audience that has stuck together with us for this fascinating topic. Before I go into the case, and I know that we need to talk about practical cases, I just want to refer to the opening, you know, with our president and AJ and Cristalina, in which, and the executive, the vice minister, in which they talked a lot in many ways about cooperation as opposed to competition. They talked about the emergency, the clock's ticking, and that brings me to an entry point to the cases that I want to talk about, which is, you know, considering the time pressure that we have to develop solutions. Considering the complexity of the problems that we are facing and their magnitude, if we continue with the status quo, we know that we are not going to get there, right? So we need to innovate. We need to be creative. And why did I make reference about cooperation as opposed to competition and working together? It's because cooperation favors innovation. It favors risk-taking in the sense that, we cannot be shy to take certain risks, and we cannot be afraid to make mistakes. No, we are at an inflection point in which we need to take risks that we didn't take before. And that risk involves making some mistakes, with the goal of developing replicable models. So in terms of instruments, I'm going to mention very quickly 3 instruments that have been implemented by the IDB group and which I think are very promising. One is an experience that IDB Invest just had with Banco Bolivariano in Ecuador. As all of you know, Ecuador is highly dependent on their marine resource, both in terms of fisheries and aquaculture. And we approved a blue bond with Banco Ecuatoriano in Ecuador, focusing on marine conservation, water conservation, and wastewater management. And obviously, a blue bond, it's not innovative by itself. There are others in the region. But what's unique on the Bolivariano blue bond is the fact that that bond is further linked to achieving or surpassing objectives. So there are incentives linked to that blue bond for going beyond the established KPIs. So this is the first type of such bond that's been done in the world. And we think this is a model that combines the traditional thematic bonds that we all know more familiar with, and link them with additional incentives so that we can go beyond. The second product that I want to mention about is an experience that the IDB, the public side, is having with Barbados, which I think it's very, very unique, which is a debt for nature swap operation backed by $150 million guarantee by the IDB and by TNC, the Nature Conservancy, to fund the savings of that guarantee would lower the cost of borrowing for the country, and the savings around $40 million would be used for investments in marine conservation. And that's, again, very unique and first of its kind, because it's the first time in the world that a multilateral bank partners with an NGO to issue a guarantee. So the guarantee has $100 million from the IDB and $50 million from TNC. So it's a very unique. And more so because we found a client, Barbados, that has incorporated those objectives of nature conservation and climate as part of their fiscal policies and fiscal strategies. So that's a very, very interesting program that we're doing. And to finalize very quickly, and our president, Elon, spoke at the beginning, he made a reference to it, a pilot that we are starting called Bid Climate, which is basically a pilot that involves a 5% or 45 basis points, a pilot using ordinary capital from the IDB in the amount of $1 billion, and we are deploying it in 10 countries for projects that have certain characteristics. Over 60% of the investments linked to climate and nature. And what we are doing is we are issuing a 5% rebate if upon 90% of the implementation of those projects, the KPIs that have been agreed are met. So basically, you're giving back 5%. And for a $1 billion pilot, that translates into $50 million that are going back, linked to the achievement of the objective. So these are just a few examples, and I'm sure that we're going to hear about other examples from the panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriel. Yeah. Great. Something that you brought that goes beyond the financial aspect of the innovation, but it's also about partnerships. That's something that we've seen also in the first panel, that is how critical it is to really connect to other stakeholders in this process of innovating. So Carola, thanks for being here with us from the Ministry of Finance of Chile. Chile is one of the countries that we invited for the Sustainable Finance Working Group. And so really count on you there to bring your experience. But please let us know a little bit more about the Chilean experience. It's something, Chile has been doing a lot, and also on green hydrogen, for example. So what are some of the key cases or instruments you'd like to highlight here that Chile has been doing the last couple of years? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Brazilian authorities for hosting us and the bid for organizing, and my panelists, co-panelists here. So yes, we've been doing a lot. I want to emphasize that we're in a triple crisis. So everything we're doing has to do with climate change, with nature and biodiversity, and pollution. So our strategy is going in that direction. We are updating our financial strategy also to include all these objectives. So the examples I'm going to be giving involve all these objectives. Of course, most of them are being supported by the IDB, capacity building, and of course also financing. So our 3 lines on the financial strategy have to do with greening the financial system, financing the green, and taking advantage of opportunities, okay? So again, everything will be within this framework. Ms. Georgieva talked about not wasting money and redirecting to activities. So 2 things we're doing there. One is building a local taxonomy with the help of the IDB, public-private coordination. We want standardization, credibility, transparency, integrity. We want the financial sector to really understand what activities are environmentally sustainable and have the confidence that when they're investing there, they're investing in an activity that fosters environment objectives relatively more than other activities. And we have lessons there. We need local features. So for instance, mining is not part of other taxonomies, and we need interoperability, and we need long-term vision. A second thing is Natural Capital Committee, and we're working there in order to have a measure that allow us not only for public policy, but also to develop what has been discussed here, instruments that are based on nature. And also, of course, to involve them in macro models, as Mr. Valdez was mentioning before. What do we need here in order to scale these activities? We need a lot of strong institutionality. To do this, we need a lot of technical cooperation and also a lot of coordination between the public and private sector and multilaterals. In financing the greens, one thing that I can obviously highlight is the innovation that we've done in terms of bonds issuance. So we were the first ones in the region to issue a green bond, and later we developed a framework to issue sustainability-linked bonds. And the latest one included not only climate key performance indicators, but also a gender indicator. So this was very innovative, was very well received by the market, and it was also awarded with the recognition of being the sustainable bond of the year by Latin Finance. What do we need here? We need credibility, we need transparency, we need rules, we need frameworks, we need ambition, we need verification. All those things, I think they're key for someone or for another country or for another company to be able to emulate and do this. And the lessons we reach diverse investors. We are able to set benchmarks for the private sector, and most importantly for us, since everything we're working has to be with a long view, with a state vision, not one administration vision, is that we're aligning our financial strategy with our climate strategy, and now more broadly with our sustainable strategy. And on the hydrogen, this is the third part of our financial strategy that has to do with taking advantage of opportunities. In our case, we have a big opportunity in green hydrogen, and we are being supported by many multilaterals, and one of them is the IDB. And this is key because we are building or confirming a facility to be able to finance projects, but the key here is to tackle risk sharing. Investors need to reduce risk in investments that are more uncertain, and we need to have market expectations and their expectations aligned with what really the development of this industry has to do. So we need to know our investors, we need to know our off-takers, we need to build local demand also, and we need to be able to provide this risk sharing between instruments that come from funding from this facility. And of course, with that purpose in mind, we will be able to leverage a lot of private capital, and that's our intention. So that's in a nutshell, if I can say.
Thanks, Carola. Well, just two quick words on it. First, there's a lot to be done when it comes to regional integration, I think, on sustainable finance. You know, I see here Jorge Arbacho has been leading the agenda on power shoring in Brazil and the relevance of that for our growth. But there's a lot we can do, I think, to connect the plans, the national plans that we are building, like the ecological transformation plan, and some others, in a way that we could really have the region as part of our growth agenda. And that obviously it is central for IDB itself. So we have whole agenda in the history of IDB, I mean, really helping the region to get together, get along, and connect in a way that our development paths could really go a lot more connected, right? And second thing is really about de-risking. So definitely it is one of the critical issues. Today we had some people here that have been discussing ideas on how to mitigate risks, how to create new instruments that would help especially developing countries in deal with that. We had just this week Brazil launching the hedging mechanism. So again, a very important aspect I think that we have that would also connect maybe the challenges that we have in the region in a way that we could try to find joint solutions there. Thank you. So, Fernand, thanks for being with us, and it's good to have you from Rwanda Development Bank. I think the national development banks, they do play a very important role in this process, and that's something we also want to reinforce from our G20. So, part of our agenda has to do with really connecting, for example, the MDB's reform agenda to country platforms and the role of national development banks in really maybe facilitating the connection between banks, multilateral development banks, and countries' needs, and also scaling up things, so really connecting to other subnational development banks, but also the private sector in our economy. So what are the instruments that the Rwanda Development Bank has been put in place in order to deal with that idea of connecting to other stakeholders, especially bringing private sector in? Thank you.
Obrigado. Thank you very much. So maybe a bit of background. I'm from Rwanda, National Development Bank of Rwanda. And if you look at, we've been in existence for the last 56 years. And in the last 56 years, we've been only raising money through lines of credit from different development partners. So as last year, we sat and looked at the influence that it started happening on the currencies, interest rates. We've talked about depreciation area here. which affected, if you look at how we raise money and the cost of it, and how can we raise concessional funding, and how can we also give it to the public at affordable rates. So we looked at the opportunity that then, if we have issues now, can we turn into an opportunity and turn to the capital market and raise private capital? So we went to the capital market and raised, and we issued, for the first time actually, for BRD was issuing a first bond of its kind, and we did a sustainability-linked bond. And in this case, the uniqueness about this bond, it was a partnership that was done with the World Bank. And thanks to the team of the World Bank sometimes back, and I can see faces here that have worked on the transaction. Anderson, that was there last year. So if you look at 2023, the SLB that we put on the market allowed us to effectively link, number one, our sustainability strategy and also our funding strategy. The other one is making it unique also was the credit enhancement that we've received from the World Bank as well. Usually, credit enhancement can be also a guarantee only that you can get and sit with it, but we've taken the same credit enhancement, the guarantee, and we've invested it. And the proceeds of that investment is going to reduce the cost of our bond. To give you perspective, we've raised a bond and we are paying almost a coupon of 12.85, and the cost of it is going to be reducing by almost 4.5%, so which allows us then to lend to the public back the money at 12%, which was a unique of its kindness. So if you look at the other one, was the first time actually the World Bank has also allowed either funds or either finance to be used for leverage. So we've taken $10 million that is going to be used as a guarantee, but we've raised 30 from the market. And if you look at that, how that initiative has been able to create, I may say, an innovative way of raising capital, raising private funds from the public in Rwanda. The other one was also the uniqueness of it was, if you look at in our country, we've been only having bonds that are issued by government of Rwanda, no more vanilla bonds. So it was part of also developing our capital market of issuing an SLB, which was one of an innovative, and the SLB, which was a new asset class that we have now on our capital market. The other one was also the commitment of Rwanda, if you look at sustainability and the sustainability finance that we do in the region. So Rwanda positioning itself. So after launching it, or after issuing it, we've seen a very good uptake from the market. It was oversubscribed by 110%. If you look at the number of subscribers, which was 128, 100 of them were retailers, and only 28 were institutions. And among the 100 retailers, 91 of them were also from the domestic and 9 from the diaspora, which it shows at the end of the day that also the savings that are in the public can also be used and brought into the table of addressing some of the issues of getting funding, but funding also for climate. So this unique transaction actually, I mentioned, was number one, first national development bank in the world to issue an SLB. And also in the East Africa, that was the number one SLB that was issued by a national development bank. So it had ambitious KPIs, most probably the same, almost similar KPIs that were mentioned by one of the panelists here of the ESG implementation, or the environmental and social management system that we want the partner financial institutions in Rwanda to implement in their processes. Number 2 was to increase women-led financing to SMEs that are led by women. And number 3 was also to finance affordable houses. So if you look at then the medium note program that we have for the next 5 years, we are looking at how can we raise 150 billion Rwandese franc, which will be $124 million in the next 5 years. And this unique innovative solution actually has won an award of the ESG Bond of the Year that we are getting actually next week in Cape Town. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ferdinand. I think it's great to hear your your case, because I think we need to connect a lot more to Africa, and that's something that President Lula himself has been quite vocal in really getting the Brazilian G20 to connect to Africa. So I think having the African Union right now in the G20 is great, but it's great to hear of great interesting cases that you have there that could really be of help for other developing countries in Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia to really move forward and connect to different pots of money as much as possible and leverage. So Jorge, coming to Brazil, and our Banco do Brasil, one of the biggest in Brazil, in fact, has been doing a lot also when it comes to climate and sustainability. And you have just launched a joint initiative with JGP to implement an asset manager specialized in ESG investments. Tell us a little bit more about it, and thank you for being with us.
Okay, thank you very much for invitation. I would like to greet my colleagues of panel, and thanks for IDB for invitation. And I'm very happy to represent Banco do Brasil in this in front of this such a qualified audience. Okay. First of all, about GJP and BB Asset partnership, I would like to say this is a recently partnership that brings one of the largest asset management in Latin America, that is BB Asset, with 1.5 trillion reais of assets under management. And the other side, JGP, with the expertise to manage ESG funds. So this is an opportunity to bring the capital markets to the table, to use the Banco do Brasil distribution and capillarity, and also to bring GDP expertise in ESG management. So Banco do Brasil has been working for a long time together with multilateral like IDB, World Bank, and other multilateral agencies. And we have some commitments, for example, to mobilize 100 billion reais until 2030 from the capital markets, from the international funding and national funding. And so in this kind of view, we have now 30 billion reais that we have already raised in the market. And also we have this committed for 100 billion in 2030. So another point that I would like to bring the highlight, and also was mentioned here, was the interest rate, the exchange rate case. Now we know that Brazilian government is working together with the ministry to bring a solution for exchange rate. And I believe that this will be one of the best things that we could have. So we can raise such more amounts using this mechanism to provide to leverage and to solve several problems of decarbonization, for example. So I would like also to bring that what we've been done for the SMEs and industry in general, because if we forget the land use problem in Brazil, we have to look at the industry. That represents 30% of our emissions. So Banco do Brasil has developed a program to decarbonize the industries, especially SME, together with a World Bank, an operation of $500 billion. And part of these resources we are using to our SOL, a sustainable linked loan instrument. So the clients will have a step down of interest rates. And so we have the companies need to have their GEG inventory to establish targets, to establish KPIs, and we are going to monitor this performance. This is one of mechanisms that we are using, and also we are launching a fund also focus on SLB, Sustainable Linked Bond, also in the same criteria. So these two initiatives together with World Bank. So it would bring a benefit for industries. And also would like to bring highlights for partnership that we've been signed with some companies that produce efficient engines, efficient motors and equipments to finance to industry, and also partnership with large companies to help them to decarbonize the scope 3 and also to help their supply chain to do the same. About agribusiness, we also have some programs. We've been helping the government together with IDB, together with World Bank, to bring some investment for forest development, forest management, and also to restore degraded areas. So this is another initiative that we believe would help the government, and also, but there are some challenges in this to do that. Anderson mentioned about the stars are aligned, but we have to prepare on the field. We have to engage the growers and ranchers to do that. And the Banco do Brasil is trying to design some specific models, including not only native species, but also exotic species with economic value. So, but it's also difficult to restore in large scale. But we are together, working together with several actors, several institutions, especially multilateral institutions. So I think this is some, I don't know, I think my time is over. I think this is some initiatives of Banco do Brasil that I would like to share with you.
Thanks, George. Great. It's great to hear what Banco do Brasil is doing, and we're always with Banco do Brasil in mind, in fact, when we need to connect to a bank that does have capillarity and is willing to really deliver a change and when it comes to sustainability. Also interesting that you brought this point that is quite present, I think, at the G20 when we talk about MDB's reform, but also on sustainable finance, that is, we need to reinforce the agenda on project preparation. And I think the multilateral development banks really need to do a lot more in that sense. I mean, maybe the system needs to do more. IDB does play a very relevant role in that sense in Brazil, and maybe is leading in that sense, because there is all the agenda on mitigation, because we need to bring inflows to projects, but we need to have the projects. And if we don't have the projects, you cannot, doesn't really, if you mitigate but you don't have the project. So, and if you think about Brazil, where we do have capacity, I mean, we have BNDES, we have Banco do Brasil, we have strong institutions that are dealing with that. But if you think about small countries that, that do not have really much of capacity and expertise, I was during last year in Washington in a meeting with a minister from a small island in Asia, and it was interesting to hear that he said, I have 10 people to work on MDBs, sustainable finance. That's my international department. And obviously, even to get money out of the CIFs, so climate investment funds or the Green Climate Fund, if the banks are not connected to bring expertise and say, look, this is the way forward, and that's why we really want to push that agenda in the G20, to streamline access. We need templates of access. We need to really make it simple so that those 10 guys there in the island in the Pacific can really do something together with some key partners, but really lowering the costs of entrance in that system. and really deliver impact. At the end of the day, there's a lot of money in those green funds that are not being used. And again, connecting to the banks is also critical. So also thinking about how we could manage to get concessional finance plugged to money from MDBs, national development banks, commercial banks, and really leverage things up in a way that we can get to at least closer to the trillions that we need to have in order to deal with transition in the world. That's the key point. So I think we had a great set of cases here. Thank you very much for bringing them. So a last round of 2 minutes final remarks, and I wonder if you'd like to bring a specific case or an instrument or an agenda you think would be absolutely critical to see, for example, in our G20 agenda, dealing with sustainable finance working group, but also at the task force on climate that President Lula created, where we do have a whole agenda on resetting finance and really trying to push for mobilization, for innovation in a way that we can really get to closer to really bridging the gaps that we need to bridge to deal with the climate imperatives and development challenge that we have. Let's start with Carola, just to change a little bit. Yeah. Thank you. Carola, please.
Surprise factor. Okay, thank you. I want to pick up on the comment that you made. This is a global crisis, has to be a global solution. We need regional coordination. So we have a Ministries of Finance, a regional platform under the IDB's support. And there we've been discussing and having some very focused groups on developing certain instruments, and one of them is like building a lot of capacity for all countries to be able to issue green bonds, thematic bonds. We've been doing workshops in Chile. We've been discussing this in other countries as well. We issued a guide to know how to issue. We also have the presidency of the LACTED group. Anderson is here, and there also we share experiences, but also not only share the experience, but just exchange knowledge, and I think that has been critical. And so that's one point that I wanted to make, because we need these things to be interoperable. Investors are not only playing in one country, they go across countries. And they need to know what the rules of the game in one country are, which they need to be clear, but also what the rules of the game are in the other country, and how the different instruments and, for instance, taxonomies work in one country and in the other one. That's completely key, and I think it's not only a lesson, but it's something that every country should be working on in order to be able to scale. This is something urgent. It should be thought in a long term. I cannot over-insist on that. And it should take into consideration not only climate, but also biodiversity. I will leave it at that, and encourage everyone to collaborate. We're here as we have the presidency on the platform, also on the LAC group. We're working on the G20 group that you invited us, and we are open to any conversations that are needed in order to share our experiences.
Thanks, Carola. Fernand, over to you.
Thank you. I'll pick it from what you said on small, low-income countries like ourselves in Africa. How can they raise money actually for green financing and also for financing green projects? And how can they create even pipelines for those projects? So in COP27, I guess we launched our first climate finance facility, which the first commitment we got from partners was around $100 million. The first drawdown, we got it last year in December, and we still have other drawdowns that we haven't taken so far. But developing even pipelines, so that facility was divided into two. A project preparation facility that will be managed by one institution called Rwanda Green Fund, and also us as BRD also providing other instruments like loans that we are giving, and also guarantees. All that was done because we wanted to address permanent issues that we usually see in the SME space that we are in, that we want to also encourage them to go green. Number one was high cost of funds. How can we get concessional funding that will come and give them money at affordable rates? Number two, most of the SMEs, when they are starting in this space of green, they don't have a track record. So how can you create a track record for them? The other one is also to look at how do we bring in other commercial banks. We are, yes, a national development bank, but how do we bring other commercial banks and other private capital that will come to fund the green transition that we want? The other one also was to address the issue on collateral in a space where we see commercial bank requiring, yes, collaterals, but can we bring other instruments like guarantees? In this case, we brought in different partners that also provided guarantees, like for women that are getting 75% of guarantee to the facility, and also men 50%, bringing also that equality in that case. So to stress on your point also, how can the access of the fund be easier but faster as well, so that we can implement programs and projects that will be able to contribute to national determined contributions target that we have. Thank you.
Thanks, Fernando. Jorge, over to you.
Okay. Well, I would like to say that it's really impressive how we have several institutions in the world mobilized to this green agenda. I've been working at this agenda for a long time, and I think the stars is also aligned. We have, but there is a train moving, and have to board it. So we have too much to do. And Banco do Brasil wants to be part of this whole, and try to design new instruments to use economic mechanisms. We have such opportunities in Brazil. For example, for forests, we have not only the extractivism potential, but also payment for environment services, and also to manage the forest and explore wood in a sustainable way. So we have to use all these mechanisms and bring value to the forest. It could represent a new agribusiness GDP for Brazil. Of course, we have several problems to take care, to lead with, but count with Banco do Brasil and we are together in this journey.
Thanks, Jorge. Gabriel, in fact, I left you to be the last one because there's a grand finale. I know you were thinking about a new instrument in the meantime, and you're about to show us new ideas of a new instrument that IDB Invest will launch tomorrow on financing solutions for nature, right?
Well, you put me on the spot, but no, we are always, and I shouldn't advance the announcement, but we are always trying, all of us are always trying to come up with new instruments, new tools for our toolbox, right? That's what we are talking about when I hear the people here in the panel. So, and here at IDB Invest, we are doing that. So we are launching some new instruments. But I want, like, as final thoughts, say that instruments are necessary. New instruments, the tool set needs to be expanded, but instruments by themselves, if they don't have the right conditions to flourish and to be replicated, they don't go very far. And so that requires an alignment of policies, of interests, of institutions. You talked about good projects, right, and upstream work, so good projects can be developed. Carola spoke about something that's really key to unlocking private flows of capital into this, which is stability, predictability, rules of the game. I think that's really important, and that relates to policy. And the others too spoke with things. So I think, we have to think about the set of instruments that we can develop. And here, I think what we are doing, exchanging, is fantastic. We shouldn't be reinventing the wheel. We can adapt the tires to different terrains, but the will should be about the same. But yes, we need to work at different levels if we really want to get anywhere close to unlocking the flow of capital that we need to fund the transformation. I think that's the key message that I would like to leave all of you with, and some curiosity about the new instruments that will be launched. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. Well, thank you all for being with us. Now you know that there's this new instrument IDB Invest is about to launch, so we're really interested in getting to know it. So thank you very much for being with us, and I hope it has been of help. Thanks IDB for the partnership, and looking forward to really touch base with you throughout the year on the agenda on sustainable finance of the G20. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to all our panelists for the great cases shared with us today. Please, Mr. Caputo, remain on stage. I want to invite once again Mr. Anderson Caputo Silva from the IDB to address the auditorium with his closing remarks. Soon we'll have him here back to the podium. And Mr. Ivan, please remain on stage after Mr. Caputo. It's your turn.
So in the closing here, and as we are closing in Brazil, and I'm Brazilian, we thought that I'm going to do the closing in Portuguese, so I'm giving time for those that need the interpretation to use, But, and I'll be very brief, because I also wanted to announce that we didn't have the coffee break, but the coffee is outside, so please stay for the coffee, and for the Brazilian, also pão de queijos and other things like this, para fechamento, eu queria começar, estamos aqui chegando ao final do nosso evento, em nome do BID, eu gostaria de expressar a nossa imensa gratidão pela participação de todos aqui. Como vocês devem imaginar, preparar um evento desse requer muito trabalho e pensar na sequência, e é uma satisfação enorme, que tivemos aqui esse grupo de palestrantes, que pudemos ter aqui. Eu quero agradecer aos palestrantes porque compartilharam insights valiosos sobre como a inovação financeira pode envolver investimentos sustentáveis. Acreditamos realmente que a inovação financeira é uma das chaves aqui para que vai permitir alcançar o necessário aumento dos fluxos financeiros climáticos. Queria também agradecer a vocês, que nos prestigiam com sua presença. Um obrigado especial. Espero que tenham, assim como eu, conhecido experiências novas, interessantes, durante o nosso evento. E precisamos repetir e insistir nesse ponto. É preciso destacar, enfatizar o tamanho da importância dessa temática que foi aqui brilhantemente debatida. E a outra coisa que ficou clara é enfatizar a urgência disso tudo. Precisamos buscar isso pensando nesse momento, já estamos sentindo na pele os efeitos. E nossa região já vem sofrendo hoje as consequências intensas das mudanças climáticas. Um muito especial também, que eu queria deixar aqui, uma menção especial, é aproveitar isso aqui para elogiar a presidência brasileira do G20. Como estamos vendo, o governo brasileiro tem buscado destacar o significativo déficit dos fluxos internacionais de capital necessários para cumprir as metas climáticas e de biodiversidade. Ao mesmo tempo, está buscando ativamente soluções para isso. E aqui, hoje, a gente teve esse privilégio, de ter o secretário Seron aqui, falando sobre o programa Eco Invest para mobilização de capital externo e de proteção cambial para a transformação ecológica, e que nós, do BID, temos imenso orgulho de ter participado de todo esse trabalho e lançar juntos, com essa semana, na segunda-feira, e o qual o BID está dedicando recursos técnicos e financeiros que vão poder chegar a 27 bilhões de reais. Ou seja, estamos colocando realmente em marcha o já conhecido jargão dos bilhões para os trilhões, né? E a gente tem que fazer esse programa funcionar, né? É por meio de inovações como essa que vamos poder aí superar os riscos, as barreiras do investimento e atingir o que todos nós estamos buscando, que é a escala, né? Então, o nosso evento aqui, como só para mencionar o tanto que nos orgulhou, né, que a gente contou com presenças ilustres, em painéis extremamente ricos, né, um evento desse que traz aqui autoridades máximas do BID, do Banco Mundial, do FMI, né, autoridades do governo brasileiro, né, todos para discutir esse processo, né? E esses esforços que todos nós aí juntos, buscando mobilizar recursos para o desenvolvimento econômico de baixo carbono, né? E o que a gente conversou aqui sobre a importância da responsabilidade institucional, ficou muito claro, sobre o papel específico de algumas das principais instituições internacionais na criação de estruturas que atraem investidores e impulsionem os investimentos climáticos. Também acompanhamos formas de se promover a atração de capital para investimentos alinhados à agenda climática, mas sempre com cuidado para não comprometer a estabilidade financeira, conforme, né, nosso colega do FMI mencionou, né, e isso especialmente para países mais pobres e emergentes, né. Precisamos buscar, e dessa vez, né, a gente fala aqui, tem uma expressão que a gente fala, né, eu conheço em inglês, não sei como, né, que a gente tem que buscar o leveling the playing field, né? Em outras palavras, assegurar que haja condições de igualdade para que as finanças climáticas se desenvolvam e se multipliquem, que é isso que a gente quer, né, frente a esse desafio que nós temos, né? Vimos também, aqui nesse último painel, né, exemplos bem práticos, né, de instituições financeiras, bancos de desenvolvimento, que estão contribuindo para a criação dessas estruturas e dessas inovações, né? Vocês viram aqui exemplos, por exemplo, na parte do BID, o BID Clima, que é um instrumento novo. Falamos dos Debt for Nature Swaps, né? Interessantíssimo ouvir aqui também o caso de Ruanda com Sustainability Linked Financing. Tem no caso, né, do Chile, que foi o primeiro soberano no mundo a emitir um título de Sustainability Linked Finance, né? E o Chile é referência para todos, para quem é gestor de dívida pública, todos conhecem o Chile, porque o Chile é uma referência internacional nesse tipo de inovações, né? E temos aí o Banco do Brasil também com várias iniciativas brilhantes, procurando também soluções com o mercado de capitais, tentando também contribuir para a biodiversidade, e entre outros, né? Então, eu queria dedicar aqui, por fim, minhas palavras, né, para ressaltar essa oportunidade única que nós temos. Eu acho que ficou claro no discurso, você falou aqui várias vezes dos stars, né, estarem aligned, né? E temos que aproveitar esse momento, né? Eu acho que essa colaboração, esse pensamento inovativo, ação coletiva, que vai ser fundamental para enfrentarmos os desafios climáticos e de biodiversidade, né? Então, que essas discussões e ideias compartilhadas aqui inspirem, né, ações transformadoras e contribuam para um futuro mais sustentável, né? Eu queria terminar, então, com o meu muito obrigado a todos pela participação e compromisso, e vamos continuar trabalhando juntos para fazer a diferença. No BID, né, na nossa missão, nós falamos, vamos continuar melhorando vidas, e é isso que a gente tem que buscar. Muito obrigado.
Thank you once again, Mr. Caputo. Now I want to invite Mr. Ivan Oliveira for the final closing remarks for this meaningful event looking toward the green transformation of the planet. Please, Mr. Ivan.
Obrigado. Vou em português, já que o Caputo foi em português. Primeiro, agradecer ao BID pelo evento e pela parceria. Acho que não tem um discurso aqui muito pronto, mas mais do que discurso, acho que o mais importante é a ação. E acho que, para a gente chegar aqui, na verdade, teve muita ação, né? E eu sou testemunha, pelo menos desde janeiro do ano passado, do quanto que o BID se conecta com o governo brasileiro e sempre esteve aí quando a gente precisou de uma ideia, de um recurso, de um financiamento, de uma conexão com o fundo climático de forma ligeira para que a gente conseguisse fazer, por exemplo, um programa junto aos fundos climáticos, os CIFs, Climate Investment Funds, no ano passado. Graças à agilidade do BID, a parceria, a gente conseguiu fazer um programa em 3 meses, que geralmente se leva 18 meses para fazer. Assim que o ministro levantou uma ideia de fazer um novo mecanismo de rede cambial, o BID estava lá à disposição para ajudar o Ministério, por meio da Secretaria de Tesouro Nacional, a montar isso. Então, eu acho que, mais do que palavras, acho que as ações nos trouxeram aqui. E no G20 também, uma parceria muito importante e interessante, especialmente na área de finanças sustentáveis, mas também aproveitando a liderança do BID agora como chefe do grupo o líder do grupo o coordenador do grupo de bancos multilaterais, também conseguir fazer com que os bancos se conectem um pouco mais. A gente já sentiu também os desafios que a gente tem no próprio sistema de bancos multilaterais e fazer os bancos se conectarem um pouco mais, facilitarem a vida do cliente, mas também pensarem mais em mecanismos de cofinanciamento, pensarem mais em mobilização de capital privado, capacidade de alavancagem de capital doméstico, enfim. E, nesse sentido, também esperamos contar com a parceria do BID para que, por meio do Heads of MDBs, a gente tenha bons inputs para as nossas entregas, por exemplo, na agenda bastante desafiadora que a gente tem de reforma dos MDBs no grupo de arquitetura financeira internacional. Na área de finanças sustentáveis, um mundo a se explorar, acho que foi muito do que a gente falou aqui hoje. Interessante ver a conexão entre os vários atores que aqui tiveram presentes ao longo do dia, da tarde, e a importância que a gente deve dar a essa conexão. Assim, sejam atores que muitas vezes chegam com um componente de knowledge, na construção de uma parceria, de um novo projeto, sejam aqueles que podem dar capilaridade e viabilidade a projetos inteiros, muitas vezes de fundos internacionais que têm dificuldade importante de acesso e conexão, especialmente a comunidades mais distantes, por exemplo, e muitas vezes é onde a gente precisa gerar impacto, por exemplo, com recursos concessionais. Então, de novo, agradecer a parceria do BID e dizer que contem com o Ministério da Fazenda nessa jornada, que nós contamos com vocês, seja no G20, seja para lidar com os desafios que o Brasil tem pela frente e conseguir entregar, de fato, uma agenda que eu entendo que o Plano de Transformação Ecológica ajuda a nortear e a colocar, para que a gente tenha planos, plataformas, mecanismos que ajudem a impulsionar a transformação do nosso país e da nossa região. Então, muito obrigado e nos vemos ao longo do ano no G20.
And with that, we come to an end of our event. So I want to thank you once again for your presence. Have a great afternoon.
Por meio de programas estruturantes e de iniciativas estratégicas, o BID apoia o país para que encontre o caminho do crescimento econômico de maneira sustentável, inclusiva e duradoura. Por meio de nossos programas, apoiamos famílias agricultoras na adoção de técnicas de cultivo que aliam preservação ambiental e produtividade agrícola. Somos o único banco multilateral com uma área dedicada à região amazônica que busca fomentar modelos de desenvolvimento econômico sustentável e inclusivo, visando beneficiar suas diversas comunidades. Também apoiamos protagonistas da economia brasileira a mobilizar recursos no crescente mercado de bonds ou títulos temáticos, em parceria com atores como o BNDES, Banco do Brasil, Eletrobras e Banco ABC Brasil. E com nossos parceiros, trabalhamos buscando inovar em setores como o de transportes. Nosso foco sempre tem como prioridade o maior ativo do país, as pessoas. Em Salvador, estamos ajudando a impulsionar o turismo como fonte de trabalho, renda e vocação para microempreendedores, especialmente mulheres negras. Prestamos suporte técnico e financeiro às secretarias de saúde e também ao setor privado para o enfrentamento da Covid-19 e seus efeitos também nas finanças hospitalares. Visando capacitar jovens para o mercado de trabalho de tecnologia, ajudamos a levar cursos de programação a mulheres, negras e trans. Para que o país e seus cidadãos realizem seu potencial, também canalizamos esforços e recursos para que o país avance em sua infraestrutura física e digital. São 26 milhões de reais em investimentos viabilizados com o apoio do BID para a estruturação de parcerias público-privadas no país. Já no setor de água e saneamento, com o Programa Socioambiental dos Igarapés de Manaus, Prosamin, estamos há 15 anos ajudando a superar o desafio das palafitas. Além disso, oferecemos suporte à transformação digital do país, pois acreditamos no seu potencial para trazer mais eficiência e produtividade. E como o Grupo BID se estrutura para apoiar o Brasil? Com mais de 120 profissionais com profundo conhecimento do país alocados nos nossos escritórios de Brasília e São Paulo, o Grupo BID é parceiro histórico do desenvolvimento do Brasil. Oferecemos ao país apoio ao setor público por meio do BID, às empresas do setor privado por meio do BID Invest e ao ecossistema de inovação por meio do BID Lab. Mais do que financiamento, oferecemos conhecimento técnico e fazemos a ponte entre soluções locais, regionais e globais. Banco Interamericano de Desenvolvimento.